The world had ceased to be a place of distinct shapes and had become a vast, breathing expanse of shadow and grain. It was not a void, but a heavy, saturated canvas of deep indigo and slate gray, applied with the rough, deliberate strokes of a charcoal stick that had long since lost its point. Here, in the heart of the northern winter, the snow did not sparkle. It did not shimmer with the romantic promise of a holiday. Instead, it lay upon the earth like a thick, woolen blanket, matted and heavy, absorbing the faint light of the moon until only a dull, matte luminescence remained. The forest was a collection of vertical lines, drawn with a heavy hand against the softer, smudged background of the drifts. These were not trees so much as interruptions in the wind, pillars of frozen bark that stood in silent judgment of the solitary figure lying motionless at their base. She was a part of the snow. To the untrained eye, she was merely another undulation in the landscape, a mound of white that had perhaps gathered over a fallen log or a hidden stone. Her camouflage was a second skin, of course, white fabric, stained here and there with the gray of old ash and the brown of dried mud, mimicking the dirty purity of the winter floor. She lay prone, her body pressed flat against the earth, separated from the frozen ground by layers of felt and wool that had long ago lost their loft but retained a stubborn, dense warmth. The cold was not an enemy to be fought, for fighting required energy, and energy was heat, and heat was life. To fight the cold was to lose. Instead, the cold was a companion, a constant, heavy presence that sat upon her back and pressed against her chest, a reminder of the gravity that held her to this spot. The air was still, or nearly so. It moved with the slow, viscous quality of oil, sliding through the needles of the pine trees with a sound that was less a whisper and more a vibration, a low-frequency hum that was felt in the teeth rather than heard in the ears. It was the sound of deep winter, a silence so profound that it had weight. When the wind did stir, it did not howl. It sighed. It moved the loose powder on the surface of the drifts with a soft, shifting noise, like dry sand passing through an hourglass. The flakes that fell were not the intricate stars of a storybook. They were small, hard pellets of ice, dust from a grinding stone in the sky, settling into the folds of her white tunic, gathering in the creases of her elbows, becoming part of the sculpture she had become. Her name was of no consequence here. Her history, her family, the village she had left behind, these were distant memories, faded like old photographs left too long in the sun, their colors washed out until only the vaguest outlines remained. Here she was only the breath. In slowly, drawing the frigid air through the nostrils, feeling it chill the back of the throat, expanding the lungs with a sharp, crisp shock. Hold. The stillness within matching the stillness without. Out slowly, a long, thin stream of vapor escaping through the woolen scarf wrapped around her face, rising and dissipating into the gray darkness, a ghost leaving the body over and over again. This was the rhythm of the night. In, hold, out. A metronome set to the slowest possible tempo, measuring a time that had no meaning. The rifle lay before her, an extension of her own skeletal structure. It was a Mosin Nagant, a creature of wood and steel, heavy and unapologetic. The stock, carved from birch, had a dark, oiled sheen that seemed to absorb the faint ambient light. It was cool to the touch, even through her mittens, a dense, solid mass that anchored her to reality. The metal barrel was a black line drawn straight into the distance, a vector pointing towards nothing. Frost had begun to bloom on the metal, microscopic crystals growing in the silence, forming delicate, fern-like patterns that would be destroyed by the heat of a single shot, should that shot ever come. But for now, the rifle was asleep, just as the forest was asleep. It was merely a weight, a burden of iron and wood that she had carried for miles and would carry for miles more. The scope was a glass eye, covered now to prevent the glint of moonlight from betraying her position, though there was no moon to speak of, only a diffuse glow behind the thick curtain of clouds. The world through the scope, when she chose to look, was a grainy circle of magnified gray, a tunnel vision that reduced the vastness of the forest to a manageable circle of potentiality. But mostly she did not look. She waited. Waiting was the profession. Shooting was merely the punctuation at the end of a very long sentence, a sentence written in hours of immobility. The sensation in her toes had receded hours ago. It was not a painful numbness, but a dull absence, as if her feet belonged to someone else, or as if they had been replaced by blocks of wood. She knew she should wiggle them just a fraction to keep the blood flowing, to remind the veins that there was still a duty to perform at the extremities. She did so, a microscopic movement inside the thick felt boots, the Valenki. The felt was stiff and scratchy, a fortress of compressed wool protecting her from the biting ice. The movement sent a faint, tingling signal up her legs, a confirmation that the connection was still intact, though frayed by the cold. The cold seeped through the soles of the boots, up through the layers of wool stockings, seeking the bone. It was a patient intruder. It did not rush. It simply waited for a moment of weakness, a gap in the armor. Her elbows rested on the snow, padded by the thick sleeves of her quilted jacket, the Telegraca. The cotton batting inside the jacket was compressed under her weight, offering less insulation at the points of contact. She could feel the hardness of the ground beneath the snow, the unforgiving frozen earth that had not seen the sun in months. It was a landscape of iron, covered in a deceptive softness. The pressure on her elbows was a dull ache, a constant, low-level signal of discomfort that she had learned to ignore. It was background noise, like the wind, like the hunger in her stomach. Hunger was another companion. It was not the sharp pang of starvation, but a hollow emptiness, a lightness in the core of her body. She had eaten a piece of dark, dense bread hours ago, chewing it slowly to extract every ounce of flavor and sustenance. It sat in her stomach now, a small knot of matter in a vast, empty space. The body had slowed down its demands. In the deep cold, the metabolism shifted, entering a state of preservation. It did not ask for feasts. It asked only for maintenance. The hunger made her head feel clear, light, almost floating. It sharpened the senses. The smell of the pine resin was distinct, sharp and turpentine-like, cutting through the neutral scent of the snow. The smell of the wet wool of her scarf, damp with her own breath, was the smell of intimacy, the only smell of humanity in a world of elemental indifference. The visual field before her was a study in texture. The snow immediately in front of her face was not a uniform white. It was composed of millions of individual grains, some opaque, some translucent, piled together in a chaotic architecture. In the darkness, they looked like grains of gray sand or ash. There were tiny shadows cast by the smallest ridges in the snow, created by the wind. A pine needle, fallen from the canopy above, lay half buried in the drift, a dark, slender stroke of charcoal against the pale paper. It was brown, almost black in this light, its surface waxy and smooth. She studied the needle. She knew its shape better than she knew her own face in this moment. She traced the curve of it with her eyes, the way it tapered to a point, the way it disrupted the perfect smoothness of the snow. It was a landmark in a micro-landscape. Beyond the needle, the snow undulated away into the darkness, rising and falling over the roots of the trees. The trees themselves were massive, silent sentinels. Their bark was rough, deeply fissured, capturing the shadows in vertical crevices. The trunks were dark gray, almost black, distinct against the snow but blending into the sky as they rose. The branches were laden with snow, heavy white paws reaching out into the void. Occasionally, a branch would groan under the weight, a sound like a ship's timber straining in a storm. A clump of snow would fall, a soft thump in the silence, followed by a fine mist of powder that drifted down like smoke. She watched the falling snow. It was hypnotic. It did not fall in straight lines but danced in the subtle currents of the air, spiraling, drifting, pausing as if undecided, then continuing its slow descent. It blurred the distance. The trees 50 meters away were distinct. The trees 100 meters away were gray ghosts. The trees beyond that were merely a darkening of the air, a thickening of the shadows. The horizon did not exist. There was only a gradual transition from the gray of the earth to the gray of the sky, a seam impossible to find. Time was measured not in minutes but in the accumulation of frost. She watched a single crystal grow on the cuff of her mitten. It started as a tiny speck, barely visible. Over the course of what felt like an hour, it expanded, shooting out delicate, jagged arms, building a complex lattice of ice from the moisture in the air. It was a slow-motion construction project, silent and perfect. She admired its geometry. It was beautiful in a cruel, indifferent way. It was a structure built of water and cold, fragile yet enduring as long as the temperature held. She was like the crystal. She was a structure built of flesh and duty, enduring as long as the will held. The scarf around her mouth was wet with condensation. It had frozen stiff in places, forming a hard, icy shell that rubbed against her chin. Inside, against her skin, it was damp and warm, a small microclimate created by her breath. The contrast between the freezing exterior and the warm interior was a constant sensation. When she inhaled, the fabric cooled. When she exhaled, it warmed. It was a cycle of thawing and freezing, a localized weather system centered on her face. Her eyelashes were heavy with frost. When she blinked, she could feel the upper and lower lashes sticking together for a fraction of a second, the ice fusing briefly before breaking apart. It made her vision feel framed, enclosed. She was looking at the world through a frosted window. Her hands, encased in the thick mittens, were curled loosely around the rifle. The trigger finger, separated in its own compartment of the mitten, rested alongside the trigger guard. She did not touch the trigger. That was forbidden until the moment of certainty. The metal of the trigger guard was cold, radiating its temperature through the wool. She flexed the finger, a tiny movement. The tendon in the back of her hand slid beneath the skin. The body was a machine, a system of levers and pulleys powered by the slow burn of oxygen and glucose. In this stillness, she became acutely aware of her own mechanics. The beat of her heart was slow, a heavy thudding in her chest that she could hear in her inner ear. Thud thud, pause, thud thud. It was the only clock that mattered. It was slow, deliberate, conserving energy, a hibernation pulse. The darkness of the woods was not uniform. It had depth. There were pools of deeper blackness beneath the low-hanging branches of the spruce trees, caves of shadow where the light could not reach. These were the places where the imagination could create monsters, but she had no energy for monsters. There were only shapes, shadows, variations in the gray scale. She scanned them methodically, left to right, near to far. A slow sweep of the eyes, moving like a searchlight without the beam. She looked for straight lines. Nature rarely created perfect straight lines. A straight line meant man. A straight line meant metal or cut wood or the edge of a uniform. She looked for color. Nature in winter was a palette of desaturation. A flash of green or yellow or red would be an alarm. But there was nothing. Only the brown of bark, the white of snow, the gray of night. She shifted her weight, a movement of millimeters. The snow beneath her crunched softly, a sound that seemed deafening in the silence. The granules of ice compressed, interlocking, forming a new mold for her body. She settled into it. The cold from the ground was a constant upward pressure. She imagined it as a blue fluid rising up through the earth, soaking into her clothes. She visualized her own body heat as a golden light, a small ember burning in her chest, pushing back against the blue fluid. It was a silent war of thermodynamics, fought on the battlefield of her own skin. The wind picked up just slightly. It rustled the tops of the pines, a sound like a distant ocean washing against a rocky shore. A fine spray of snow was dislodged from the canopy, drifting down through the darkness. It settled on her shoulders, on the back of her head, on the barrel of the rifle. She did not brush it off. To move was to break the spell. To move was to become visible. She let the snow bury her. She was becoming part of the landscape, literally. If she lay here long enough, she would be indistinguishable from a fallen log covered in moss and snow. This was the goal, to cease to be a person and become an object. Objects did not feel cold. Objects did not feel fear. Objects simply were. Her mind drifted, untethered by the demands of conversation or action. It floated in a strange, liminal space between wakefulness and sleep. It was not a true sleep. Her eyes were open, her senses were alert, but it was a trance. Thoughts came and went like the drifting snow, a memory of a warm stove, the smell of tea, the texture of a wool blanket that wasn't frozen. These thoughts were dangerous. They invited longing, and longing brought weakness. She pushed them away gently, like brushing a cobweb from her face. She returned to the sensory immediate, the grain of the snow, the silence, the weight of the rifle. The air grew colder as the night deepened. The temperature dropped by degrees, an invisible tightening of the screw. She could feel the air becoming sharper, more brittle. It stung the exposed skin around her eyes. It made the hairs inside her nose freeze instantly upon inhalation. The moisture in the air was sublimating, turning directly from vapor to ice. The world was solidifying. The very atmosphere seemed to be hardening, turning into a block of dark crystal. She was encased in it. She was a specimen preserved in ice. She focused on the tree directly ahead of her, perhaps 30 meters away. It was a birch, its white bark peeling in curled strips, dark fissures marking its trunk like ancient runes. It stood slightly apart from the darker pines, a ghostly figure in the gloom. The white of the bark was a different white than the snow, creamier, more yellow, textured like old parchment. She studied the peeling layers. They fluttered slightly in the breeze, a frantic, paper-like movement. Flap, flap, flap. A tiny sound, barely audible. It was the only thing moving in her field of view. She watched it for what seemed like an hour. The repetition was soothing. It was a loop of motion, consistent and predictable. Her legs felt heavy, as if the blood in them had turned to mercury. The contact with the ground was total. She was grounded in the electrical sense, her potential energy dissipated into the earth. She felt the curvature of the hill she lay upon. She felt the roots of the trees beneath the soil, a tangled network of wood seeking water in the frozen depths. She felt connected to the forest, not as an intruder, but as a root herself. She was drawing sustenance from the patience of the trees. They stood for decades in the cold. She only had to stand for hours. It was a small thing. The silence was broken by the snap of a twig. It was a sharp, distinct crack like a pistol shot in a library. It came from somewhere to her right, deep in the shadows of the tree line. Her eyes did not dart. Her head did not turn. Her body did not tense. That would be the amateur's reaction. Instead, her attention shifted, sliding sideways like a liquid. She focused her hearing on the sector where the sound had originated. She waited. Was it the wind breaking a brittle branch? Was it the weight of the snow snapping a limb? Or was it a footfall? She listened. The wind sighed again. The snow hissed softly. There was no follow-up sound, no rhythmic crunch of boots, no heavy breathing, no clink of metal on wood, just the silence rushing back in to fill the void left by the snap. She held her breath, counting the seconds. 1, 2, 3, 10, 20. Nothing. It was the forest settling, the wood contracting in the cold, the natural entropy of the winter night. She exhaled slowly, the white plume of her breath rising straight up before being caught by the breeze. The tension in her shoulders remained, a low-level readiness, but the immediate alarm faded. She returned to the study of the gray world. The light was changing almost imperceptibly. It was not getting brighter, but the quality of the darkness was shifting. The deep, inky blue of the true night was giving way to a colder, steelier gray. It was the very beginning of the transition towards morning, though the sun was still hours away. The sky above the trees was a flat, featureless expanse. There were no stars. The clouds were a ceiling, low and oppressive. They trapped the cold against the earth. She blinked slowly. Her eyelids felt heavy, sandpaper dry. The moisture on her lashes had frozen into tiny beads of ice. She had to blink with intention, forcing the lids down and then up again. It was a mechanical action. The image of the snowy woods refreshed with each blink unchanged. The birch tree, the dark pines, the undulation of the drifts, the black needle on the white snow. It was a still life painting, frozen in time. She was the viewer and the subject. A sense of timelessness pervaded the scene. Had she been here for an hour, a day, a century? The concept of a clock was absurd in this place. There was only the cycle of the cold that came from the air and the cold that radiated from the ground. She was the sandwich filling between two slices of ice. Her body warmth was a precious resource, hoarded in the core, protected by the layers of wool and cotton. She visualized her heart pumping the warm blood, sending it out on supply runs to the limbs, only to have it return cooled and sluggish. She had to keep the core fire burning. She flexed her abdominal muscles, a tiny isometric contraction. It generated a spark of heat. It was a secret movement, invisible from the outside. The rifle barrel seemed to have grown darker. The bluing on the steel was deep and rich, almost black. It looked wet, though she knew it was dry and frozen. It was a tool of precision, forged in fire, now living in ice. She respected it. She trusted it. It was the only thing in this world that would do exactly what she asked of it, instantly and without complaint. The relationship between a sniper and their rifle was not one of affection, but of absolute reliance. It was a marriage of necessity. She looked at the snow directly under the barrel. There was a small depression where the muzzle had rested earlier before she shifted it. The impression of the steel was stamped into the snow, a perfect mold. It looked like a fossil, a trace of presence. The snow held memory. Every movement she made left a record. This was why she moved so little, to leave no history, to be a ghost. The wind shifted direction. It was now coming from behind her, blowing over her prone form and towards the trees. This was good. It carried her scent away from the target area. It carried the vapor of her breath away from her line of sight. It was a small mercy from the elements. She felt the cold air pushing against the soles of her boots, sliding up the legs of her trousers. It found the gaps in the fabric, the places where the layers overlapped. It was a persistent draft, a finger of ice tracing the line of her calf. She did not shudder. Shuddering was a loss of control. She accepted the cold. She acknowledged it. She let it pass. The landscape was a series of grays. Charcoal gray for the tree trunks, slate gray for the shadows, pearl gray for the snow and the ambient light, dove gray for the sky. It was a monochromatic world stripped of the distraction of color. It was a sketch drawn on rough paper, the lines soft and blurry. The lack of color made the textures more important: the roughness of the bark, the smoothness of the snow, the matte finish of the fabric, the gloss of the rifle bolt. Her eyes feasted on these textures, processing the information, looking for anomalies. Everything was still. The birch bark had stopped flapping. The wind had lulled. The forest was holding its breath. In this absolute silence, she could hear the blood rushing in her ears, a high-pitched whine that was the sound of her own nervous system. It was the sound of being alive in a dead place. She focused on it, using it as a centering tone. The whine, the thud of the heart, the hiss of the breath. These were the sounds of existence. She was the sniper girl, but right now she was just the girl in the snow. The title was a function, the reality was the endurance. She lay in the white snow, a dark smudge on a pristine canvas, waiting for the world to turn, waiting for the light to change, waiting for the moment that would justify the freezing. Until then, there was only the cold, the deep, abiding, eternal cold of the winter woods. The darkness did not lift so much as it began to dilute. It was a slow, chemical change in the atmosphere, as if a single drop of milk had been introduced into a vat of ink, swirling lazily, turning the absolute black into a heavy, suffocating gray. The forest remained a sketch in charcoal and slate, but the lines were becoming marginally more defined. The separation between the trunk of the pine and the shadow it cast was no longer theoretical. It was beginning to exist as a visual reality. The world was emerging from the void, reconstruction by slow degrees, pixelated by the falling snow and the grain of the low light. She had not moved. To move would be to shatter the brittle shell of warmth she had constructed around herself. It was a fragile ecosystem, this thin layer of trapped air between her skin and the wool, and any shift of a limb, any rotation of the torso would pump the freezing air into the sanctuary. So she lay in absolute stasis, a statue toppled into the drift. Her body had settled further into the snow, the white powder packing tight around her form, creating a mold that held her fast. She was becoming fossilized in real time, the weight of the winter pressing her down into the earth, merging the fabric of her uniform with the frozen floor of the woods. The cold had changed its character. In the earlier hours, it had been a sharp, biting intruder, attacking the exposed skin and the extremities. Now it was a heavy, dull pressure, a gravitational force. It felt as though the air itself had solidified, pressing against her eyelids, her chest, the backs of her hands. It was a hydrostatic pressure, the weight of a frozen ocean resting on the forest floor. She felt it in her teeth, a deep, resonant ache that pulsed in time with her slow heartbeat. She felt it in the marrow of her bones, a lethargy that whispered of sleep, of closing the eyes and simply drifting away into the white silence. But she did not sleep. The mind was a watchman pacing the perimeter of consciousness. It was detached from the body, floating somewhere above the frozen form, observing the scene with a cool, clinical detachment. She monitored the sensation in her fingers, faint, distant, like radio signals from a far-off station. She monitored the stiffness in her neck, a rod of iron replacing the spine. She monitored the rhythm of her breath, the only movement in a landscape of stone and ice. Inhale. The air was a mixture of pine resin and ozone, cleaner than anything human, sharper than glass. It tasted of ancient ice, of glaciers grinding against bedrock. Exhale. The steam rose, a gray wraith in the twilight, curling, twisting, dissipating. It was the exhaust of the machine, the proof of life in the land of the dead. Her eyes were fixed on the middle distance, focusing on nothing and everything. The scope of the rifle was a dark circle at the bottom of her vision, a dormant eye. She did not look through it yet. The light was too poor, the shadows too deceptive. Instead, she used her naked eyes to scan the texture of the snow. The surface was not smooth. Under the growing light, it revealed itself to be a landscape of infinite complexity. There were ridges and valleys, dunes no higher than a finger's width, carved by the wind. There were craters where clumps of snow had fallen from the branches above. There were delicate bridges of ice spanning gaps between fallen needles. She traced the line of a small drift that had formed against the side of a fallen log. It curled like a breaking wave, frozen in the moment of crashing. The underside of the curve was deep blue, a shadow so rich it looked like velvet. The crest of the wave was pale gray, catching the faint ambient light. It was a perfect geometric form, sculpted by the random collision of wind and water. She found it beautiful. In the absence of comfort, beauty was a sustenance. The curve of the snow, the vertical line of the tree, the chaotic lattice of the branches, these were the things that kept the mind anchored. The silence was no longer absolute. As the dawn approached, the forest began to creak. It was the sound of thermal expansion and contraction, the wood reacting to the microscopic shifts in temperature. A branch high above snapped with a sound like a dry bone breaking. A tree trunk groaned, a low, mournful sound that vibrated through the ground and into her chest. It was the language of the timber, a slow conversation about endurance and stress. Crack, groan, sigh. The sounds were spaced minutes apart, punctuating the stillness like slow, rhythmic percussion. She felt a cramp beginning to form in her right calf. It was a small knot of muscle tightening, a protest against the immobility. She did not panic, she did not jerk the leg. She simply directed her attention to the muscle, visualizing it relaxing. She sent a mental command of warmth and release. Slowly, incrementally, she flexed the foot inside the felt boot, stretching the calf. The wool of the stocking rubbed against her skin, a rough, dry friction. The cramp subsided, leaving behind a dull echo of pain. It was a reminder that the body was still biological, still subject to the laws of physiology. It wanted to move. It wanted to run. It wanted heat. She denied it all. The wind shifted again, coming now from the north, a direct draft from the pole. It carried with it a flurry of fine, hard snow like diamond dust. The crystals hit her face with a soft tchk sound, pricking the skin. They gathered in the eyebrows, on the eyelashes, in the weave of the scarf. She blinked them away, her lashes interlocking with a sticky, frozen adhesion. The world blurred for a moment, then cleared as the ice broke. Visually, the scene was shifting from the flat charcoal of night to a bruised blue-toned dawn. The vintage-colored pencil aesthetic was strong here. The darkness was not black, but a deep, saturated indigo, layered with strokes of slate and charcoal. The light was not white, but a pale, sickly lavender that seemed to seep up from the snow itself. The textures were rough, grainy. The air looked particulate, as if one could see the individual atoms of nitrogen and oxygen suspended in the cold. It was a heavy, textured atmosphere, thick and tangible. She focused on the rifle again. The wood of the stock was a warm tone in a cool world, a deep reddish-brown birch that seemed to hold a memory of the sun. The grain of the wood was visible now, swirling patterns of growth rings that told the story of the tree's life. She traced the patterns with her eyes. A knot in the wood looked like a dark eye staring back at her. The varnish was dull with frost, a matte finish that absorbed the light. The bolt handle stuck out at a sharp angle, a harsh, metallic line. It was cold steel, unforgiving. If she touched it with a bare hand, her skin would stick to it, fused by the ice. She kept her mittens on. The waiting was a physical substance. It occupied the space between the trees. It filled her lungs. It was not a passive waiting, it was an active state of being. It was the tension of a coiled spring held in check by a rusted lock. She was waiting for a movement that might never come. She was waiting for a shadow to detach itself from the darkness. She was waiting for the enemy. But the enemy was an abstract concept. In this moment, the only real enemy was the temperature. The enemy soldier, if he existed, was just another man freezing in the snow somewhere, a mirror image of herself, wrapped in wool, breathing steam, wondering if his toes were still there. They were united in their suffering, separated only by a strip of frozen woodland and the color of their uniforms. A bird flew across her field of vision. It was a raven, a jet-black silhouette against the gray sky. It moved silently, its wings rowing the heavy air. It landed on a branch of the birch tree, shaking loose a cascade of snow that fell like a white curtain. The bird sat there, a dark blot of ink, turning its head side to side. It looked intelligent, malicious, alive. Its feathers were sleek and oily, repelling the cold. It cawed once, a harsh, guttural sound that tore through the silence like a saw blade. Craw. The sound echoed, bouncing off the tree trunks, fading into the distance. Then silence returned, heavier than before. She watched the raven. It was a spectator. It knew she was there. It saw the anomaly in the snow, the mound that breathed, but it did not care. To the raven, she was just part of the geography, a potential carrion perhaps, but for now just a shape. The bird preened a wing, indifferent to the temperature that would kill a human in hours without protection. It was built for this. She was not. She was an alien here, sustained by technology, by the loom that wove the wool, by the felt maker who pressed the boots, by the gunsmith who forged the barrel. Without these things, she was nothing. The light continued to strengthen, shifting from indigo to a cold, steel blue. The shapes of the trees became three-dimensional. She could see the texture of the bark on the nearest pine, rough plates of armor, puzzled together, covered in lichen that looked like dried gray sea foam. The lichen was brittle, frozen hard. If she touched it, it would crumble to dust. The snow around the base of the tree was pockmarked with tiny holes where meltwater had dripped from the branches days ago and refrozen. Her stomach rumbled, a deep, internal shifting of fluids and gas. It was a loud sound in the quiet space of her own body. She ignored it. Hunger was a distraction. It was the body's attempt to hijack the mind's priority. The priority was the sector. The sector was the wedge of forest visible through the gap in the trees. It was a corridor of white and gray leading to a small clearing. That was the kill zone. That was where the line of sight was clear. She visualized the bullet's path. It would leave the muzzle at supersonic speed, breaking the sound barrier with a crack that would shatter the morning. It would spin through the cold air, battling the drag, battling the crosswind, dropping slightly due to gravity. It would punch through the paper target of the air and strike. What? There was nothing there. Just the white snow, smooth and unbroken. She played the scenario in her mind to keep the neural pathways warm. Lift the bolt, slide it back. The brass cartridge ejects, spinning in the air, landing in the snow with a hiss. Push the bolt forward. A new round slides into the chamber. Lock the bolt down, acquire target, exhale, squeeze. It was a ritual, a liturgy of mechanics. She repeated it mentally, checking for errors. Was the bolt sticky? Was the firing pin spring stiff? The cold affected everything. Oil turned to gum. Metal shrank. Wood warped. She had stripped the bolt of all heavy grease before coming out, leaving only a thin film of kerosene to lubricate it. Kerosene didn't freeze. It was a trick of the trade. The numbness in her feet was climbing. It had passed the ankles and was moving up the shins. It felt like her legs were being slowly turned to stone, emerging from the ground up. She wiggled the toes again. The response was sluggish. The signal had to travel through a swamp of cold to reach the muscles. She clenched her thighs, large muscle groups that generated more heat. Contract, hold, release. She felt a faint wave of warmth wash down towards the knees. It was a small victory. The sky above was a heavy, oppressive lid. The clouds were thick, a uniform sheet of gray stratus that blocked the sun completely. There would be no sunrise today, no golden hour. There would only be a gradual lightening of the gray, a transition from dark gray to medium gray. The light was flat, shadowless, making depth perception difficult. The world looked two-dimensional, like a faded backdrop in a theater. She noticed a small spider, incredibly, moving across the snow near her elbow. It was a tiny black speck, crawling slowly over the peaks and valleys of the ice crystals. How was it alive? Where was it going? It moved with a jerky, halting rhythm. It climbed a blade of frozen grass, paused at the top, waving its front legs, then descended the other side. She watched it with intense fascination. It was a fellow traveler, a survivor. It disappeared into a crevice in the snow, gone as quickly as it had appeared. The breath inside the scarf was becoming uncomfortable. The fabric was sodden, heavy with moisture. It clung to her lips. She pushed her jaw forward, trying to create a small air pocket. The wet wool tasted of sheep and stale air. It was a suffocating feeling, but removing the scarf was not an option. The exposed skin would freeze in minutes. The wind chill was deceptive. It stripped heat away faster than the body could replace it. She shifted her gaze to the tree line on the far side of the clearing. It was a wall of dark vertical lines, a barricade of timber. Was there movement there? A shadow that didn't belong. She narrowed her eyes, squinting against the flat light. She scanned the gaps between the trees. Dark, 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 gray, white, dark. Pattern recognition. The human brain was hardwired to find faces, to find symmetry. She looked for the symmetry of shoulders, the oval of a face, the straight line of a rifle barrel. There was nothing, just the chaotic order of the forest. The wind sighed through the upper branches, a lonely, desolate sound. It sounded like the earth itself was exhaling. The tops of the pines swayed gently, a rhythmic hypnosis. Left, right, left, right. The movement was sedative. It dragged at her eyelids. It whispered that it was okay to close them just for a second, just to rest the eyes. She widened them deliberately. She focused on the grain of the paper-like bark of the birch. She counted the dark horizontal slashes on the trunk. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Focusing on detail was the antidote to sleep. Counting was the anchor. The snow beneath her chest was beginning to melt slightly from her body heat, then refreeze as the water wicked away into the lower layers. She lay on a plate of ice of her own making. The cold was attacking from below, a silent thief stealing her warmth through conduction. She arched her back slightly, lifting her chest off the ground for a second, breaking the contact. The air that rushed into the gap was freezing, but it broke the bridge of ice. She settled back down. A flake of snow landed on the rear sight of the rifle. It was large, complex, a perfect stellar dendrite. She looked at it closely, her face only inches away. She could see the 6 primary arms, the delicate branching structures off each arm. It was a masterpiece of crystallography, created in the upper atmosphere, traveling miles down to land here on a piece of Soviet steel. As she watched, the edges of the crystal began to round. The sharp points softened. It was dying. The microscopic heat radiating from the metal was destroying it. In 10 seconds, it was a droplet of water. In 20 seconds, it was a patch of ice. The passage of time was marked by these small destructions. a snowflake melting, a vibration in the wood, a shift in the wind. There were no minutes, only events. The concept of 0700 hours was meaningless. There was only before the light and during the light. She felt a deep, profound loneliness. It was not an emotional sadness, but a factual state of being. She was a single point of consciousness in a vast, indifferent grid of cold. The rest of her unit was miles away. The enemy was miles away. The world of warm houses and hot soup and laughter was a different planet. Here, there was only the physics of survival, the conservation of energy, the stillness. Her ears picked up a sound, a soft thump. It was snow falling from a branch hitting the ground, then another thump. The forest was shedding its coat. The temperature must be rising just a fraction of a degree, enough to loosen the bond between the snow and the bark. Or perhaps the wind was shaking it loose. It created a series of false alarms. Each thump sounded like a footstep. Thump step, thump step. She listened intently, filtering the noise. Steps had a cadence. Falling snow was random. The rhythm was chaotic. It was nature, not man. She relaxed her grip on the rifle stock. She hadn't realized she was gripping it tight. Her muscles were tense, holding a static charge. She forced them to go limp. Shoulders down, arms loose, hands soft. The tension drained away, replaced by the heavy leaden feeling of the cold. The world was now fully in the grip of the blue hour. The deep indigo had faded to a flat slate blue. The visibility had extended to perhaps 200 meters. The charcoal sketch was filling in with detail. She could see the texture of the snow in the clearing, a field of white waves, frozen in time. It looked impenetrable, deep. To walk across it would be a struggle, wading waist-deep in powder. She imagined the effort of walking, the lift of the leg, the drag of the heavy boot, the resistance of the snow, the burning of the lungs. It made her tired just to think of it. Lying still was easier. Lying still was safe. Lying still was the mission. The silence wrapped around her like another layer of wool. It was heavy, muffling her thoughts. It pressed against her ears. It was a silence that demanded nothing. It simply was. And in that silence she waited. A stone in the stream of the wind. A shadow in the field of white. A watcher in the vintage blue drawing of the winter woods. The day had fully established itself, though day was a generous term for the slate-gray twilight that now hung over the forest. The transition from dawn to morning had been seamless, a subtle brightening of the charcoal sketch that surrounded her, a lifting of the heaviest shadows to reveal the infinite, repetitive details of the winter woods. The sky was a ceiling of pressed pulp, a heavy, fibrous expanse of cloud that allowed no direct sunlight to penetrate. It was a light box emitting a cool, shadowless luminescence, flattening the world below into a landscape of 2 dimensions. There were no hard edges, no stark contrasts of black and white. Everything was a variation of gray, a spectrum of desaturation that ranged from the dirty white of the old snow to the deep, bruised purple of the distant tree line. She lay embedded in this monochrome world, a permanent fixture of the forest floor. The snow had ceased to be a surface she rested upon and had become a mold that encased her. The heat of her body, meager as it was, had melted the crystals directly beneath her coat, creating a microscopic layer of water that had immediately refrozen into a cradle of ice. She was locked into the earth, fused to the geography by the very laws of thermodynamics she fought against. To move now would require breaking this seal, a cracking of the ice shell that would sound like a gunshot in the silence. So she did not move. She remained liquid inside the shell, her blood moving slow and thick, her breath the only evidence of the biological engine still turning over within the layers of wool and felt. The visual fatigue was setting in. Staring at a field of white and gray for hours created a specific kind of hallucination. The retina, starved of color and contrast, began to manufacture its own data. She saw faint, swimming patterns in the snow, like the grain of old film or the static of a dead channel. Ghostly shapes drifted across her peripheral vision, dark smudges that vanished when she turned her eyes to catch them. They were phantoms of the optic nerve, tricks played by the brain desperately seeking a pattern in the chaos of the natural world. She knew them for what they were. She did not react. She let the gray ghosts drift, acknowledging them as artifacts of the weight, just as the cold was an artifact of the season. The air was clearer now, the morning mist having sublimated into the dry cold. The visibility extended deep into the forest, a tunnel of vertical lines. The trees were drawn with a heavy hand, their trunks thick strokes of graphite against the paper-white background. The bark of the pines was not brown, but a deep, blackened gray, fissured and scaled like the skin of some ancient, dormant reptile. In the flat light, the roundness of the trunks was lost. They looked like flat strips of darkness pasted onto the scene. Only the snow clinging to their windward sides gave them volume, a white highlight that defined their cylindrical nature. She focused her attention on a single pine cone lying in the snow a few meters away. It was old, weathered, its scales open to release seeds that had long since flown. It was a perfect piece of natural geometry, a Fibonacci spiral carved in wood. It was dark, wet-looking, stark against the pristine powder. She studied it with the intensity of a jeweler examining a diamond. She counted the scales. She traced the curve of its spine. She imagined the weight of it. It was an anchor for her mind, a small, tangible object that proved the reality of the world when everything else felt like a dream. If the cone was real, then she was real. If the cone existed, then the cold existed and the duty existed. The silence of the morning was different from the silence of the night. The night silence was heavy, pressurized, a blanket weighing down the earth. The morning silence was brittle, sharp, expectant. It was a silence that seemed to be waiting for a sound to break it. The wind had died down to a mere whisper, a faint current of air that moved the topmost needles of the spruce trees but left the forest floor in a vacuum of stillness. In this vacuum, the sound of her own body was amplified. The friction of air moving through her windpipe was a roar. The creaking of her ribcage as it expanded and contracted against the stiff canvas of her jacket was the sound of a ship straining at anchor. Her extremities had entered a new phase of cold. The numbness had transitioned into a dull, throbbing ache, a deep bone pain that felt like her marrow was crystallizing. It was a rhythmic pain pulsing with her heartbeat. Throb, throb, throb. It was not sharp enough to be alarming, just a constant, heavy reminder of the hostile environment. She visualized her toes inside the felt boots. She imagined them as separate entities, distant colonies of flesh that were slowly losing contact with the capital. She sent a mental command to wiggle the big toe of her right foot. There was a delay, a lag in the transmission, and then a faint, phantom sensation of movement. It was enough. The line was still open. The rifle, the Mosin Nagant, was a bar of cold iron across her vision. The frost on the barrel had thickened, forming a fuzzy white coating that softened the hard lines of the metal. It looked like a branch covered in hoarfrost, perfectly camouflaged. The wooden stock, however, remained dark and smooth, the oil in the wood repelling the moisture. She could smell the rifle, a complex bouquet of gun oil, solvent, old wood, and cold steel. It was a metallic chemical scent that cut through the organic smells of the forest. It was the smell of war, sanitized by the winter. She shifted her gaze to the clearing ahead. It was a blank page, a theater stage with no actors. The snow lay in undulations, smoothing over the rough ground, hiding rocks and roots under a uniform blanket. The surface was textured with wind ripples, tiny dunes of ice dust that caught the flat light. To the untrained eye, it was just white. To her eye, it was a map of the wind. She could see where the gusts had scoured the surface, exposing the harder crust beneath. She could see where the drifts had piled up in the lee of the bushes. She read the snow like a text, looking for the disruption that would indicate a footprint, a drag mark, a disturbance. There was nothing. The page was unwritten. A single dry needle fell from the canopy above. It drifted down in a slow, erratic spiral, a tiny dark line spinning in the gray air. It landed on the back of her glove with a microscopic impact she felt rather than heard. It lay there, a brown slash across the green wool. She stared at it. It was a visitor from the vertical world descending to her horizontal one. It was brittle, sharp-pointed. It was a minute alteration in her camouflage. She considered brushing it off. The movement would cost energy. It would create motion. She decided against it. The needle belonged there. It was part of the accumulation. She was becoming the forest floor. The hunger in her stomach had passed the point of discomfort and entered a state of hollow clarity. The body had accepted the lack of input and switched to its reserves. She felt light, ethereal, as if her consciousness was expanding beyond the boundaries of her skull. It was a common sensation in the deep cold, a dissociation that was both useful and dangerous. Useful because it detached her from the suffering, dangerous because it detached her from the danger. She grounded herself by pressing her tongue against the roof of her mouth. The flesh was warm, moist, a contrast to the dry, frozen exterior. I am here. I am flesh. The air she breathed was not just cold, it was dry, desiccated. It pulled moisture from her lungs with every exhalation. She could feel the dryness in her throat, a scratchy, parchment-like sensation. She swallowed, a dry click in her ears. She had a flask of water inside her jacket, kept liquid by her body heat, but she did not drink. Movement was risk. Breaking the seal of the jacket was risk. Thirst was just another sensation to be catalogued and ignored. The discipline of the sniper was the discipline of denial. Deny the cold, deny the hunger, deny the thirst, deny the self. She looked at the trees across the clearing again. They were dense, a wall of vertical strokes. The spaces between them were filled with shadows that seemed to possess a physical weight. She scanned the darkness between the trunks. Her eyes moved in a grid pattern. Bottom left to bottom right, up 1 meter, right to left, up 1 meter, left to right. It was a mechanical sweep, a radar dish turning. She looked for the break in the pattern, the horizontal line in a vertical world. The patch of color that didn't fit the gray scale. The texture that was smooth cloth instead of rough bark. There was a shape that caught her eye, a dark mound near the base of a spruce. She froze her gaze on it. She stopped breathing. The shape was rounded, roughly the size of a helmet. It was darker than the snow, lighter than the bark. She stared at it, willing it to resolve. Was it a rock, a stump, a man? She watched for movement. She watched for the rhythmic rise and fall of breath. She watched for the steam of an exhale. The shape remained static. The wind blew a wisp of snow over it. It did not flinch. It was a rock. She exhaled slowly. The tension leaked out of her shoulders, leaving the dull ache of the cold in its place. Paranoia was a tool, but it had to be calibrated. Too much, and she would see enemies in every shadow. Too little, and she would be dead before she heard the shot. She maintained a level of suspicious detachment, Everything was innocent until proven guilty. The rock was innocent. The tree was innocent. The bird was innocent. But the potential for guilt was everywhere. The light barely changed as the morning wore on. The sun was a theoretical concept, a rumor of warmth somewhere above the cloud deck. Here in the bottom of the atmospheric ocean, the light was stagnant. It was a vintage pastel world drawn on gray paper. The colors were muted, subdued. The green of the pine needles was almost black. The brown of the branches was desaturated to a gray sepia. The white of the snow was blue-tinted, reflecting the sky. It was a somber, melancholic palette. She thought of the fire, not a specific fire, but the concept of fire. The plasma, the oxidation, the heat. She visualized a flame, orange and yellow, dancing on a wick. She imagined the sensation of holding her hands near it, the skin tightening, the blood rushing to the surface, the pain of the thaw. The image was vivid, almost hallucinatory. She could smell the burning wood. She pushed the image away. It was dangerous. It made the cold feel colder by comparison. It created a longing that weakened the resolve. She returned to the ice. The ice was the reality. The ice was the truth. Her cheek pressed against the rifle stock. The wood was cold, but not as cold as the metal. It was a smooth, hard pillow. She adjusted the angle of her head by a fraction of a millimeter to relieve the pressure on her cheekbone. The movement caused the wool of her hat to rub against her ear, a loud scratching sound. Scratch, scratch. It was the loudest sound she had heard in hours. It sounded like footsteps in the snow. She paused, heart rate spiking. She listened. Only the wind. Only the silence. The boredom was a physical weight. It was not the boredom of waiting for a bus. It was the boredom of geology. It was the slow, grinding passage of time that eroded mountains. The mind sought escape. It wanted to replay memories, to sing songs, to solve puzzles. She allowed it a short leash. She counted the trees in her immediate vicinity. 11 pines, 4 birches, 2 saplings of indeterminate species. She memorized their positions. She built a mental map of her immediate surroundings. This was her universe. These 17 trees were her companions. A small clump of snow fell from her own shoulder. She must have shivered, a micro-tremor she hadn't consciously registered. The snow slid down the sleeve of her jacket and landed near her elbow. It was a betrayal of her own body. The shivering reflex was the enemy. It was movement. It was noise. She focused her will on her core muscles. Be still. Be stone. She tightened the abdominal wall, locking the torso. The shivering stopped. The cold remained, but the movement ceased. The scope of her world was shrinking. In the beginning, she had been aware of the forest, the hill, the valley. Now she was aware only of the clearing, the scope, the bolt, the trigger. The periphery was fading. The universe was narrowing down to a single vector, the line from her eye to the target zone. This tunneling of focus was a trance state. It was a meditation on death. The texture of the snow in front of her face fascinated her. She could see the layers of stratification in a small cross-section cut by the wind. There was a hard, icy crust on top. Beneath that, a layer of sugary, faceted crystals. Beneath that, the dense, packed powder of the deep winter. It was a geological history of the last few storms. Each layer told a story of wind direction, temperature, and humidity. She read the history of the winter in the snow. She became aware of the blood flow in her eyes. When she looked at the bright snow, she could see the faint, squiggly lines of her own capillaries, transparent floaters drifting across the blue-white field. It was like looking through a microscope at her own biology. She was watching herself exist. It was a strange loop of observation. The wind picked up again, a sudden gust that rattled the birch branches. The peeling bark fluttered frantically. The sound was like dry leaves skittering on pavement. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The noise masked everything else. It was a moment of vulnerability. If someone moved now, she wouldn't hear them. She scanned the tree line intensely, relying entirely on vision. The wind died as quickly as it had risen, leaving the silence ringing in her ears. She felt a heaviness in her eyelids, a desire to close them just for a moment to moisten the dry surface. She blinked, a slow, deliberate closure. The darkness lasted for half a second. In that half second, the world disappeared. When the lids lifted, the gray world rushed back in, unchanged, unmoving. The consistency of the scene was maddening. It was a still photograph that she was forced to inhabit. The cold was seeping through the elbows of her jacket now, a sharp pain where the weight of her upper body compressed the insulation. The contact points were the weak points: knees, elbows, belly. The cold was mapping her body, finding the places where she pressed against the earth. She tried to levitate mentally, to imagine a layer of warm air between her and the ground. It was a futile exercise in mind over matter, but it occupied the thoughts. Somewhere in the distance, a tree cracked with the sound of a pistol shot. It was a loud, sharp bang. It echoed through the valley. It was the frost splitting the timber. The sap inside the tree froze, expanded, and shattered the wood fibers. It was the forest destroying itself in the cold. She did not flinch. She knew the sound. It was the artillery of nature. It meant the temperature was dropping again, or perhaps rising. Change was stress. She breathed in. The air was thick, heavy, like breathing water. She breathed out. The vapor cloud was substantial, a solid white object that hung in front of her face for a second before drifting away. She was a steam engine, chugging slowly in the wilderness. The vintage-colored pencil style of her vision was becoming more pronounced as the eye fatigue worsened. The edges of the trees seemed to have a dark outline, drawn in heavy charcoal. The snow seemed to have a grain, a texture of paper. The shadows were cross-hatched. The world was becoming art, becoming static, becoming less real. She was trapped in a drawing. She wondered idly if she was still alive. It was a strange thought, but valid. If she lay here long enough, would she simply stop? Would the transition from stillness to death be noticeable? Perhaps she was already a ghost, haunting the woods, waiting for a war that had ended years ago. The thought was seductive. It removed the responsibility. But then the cold bit her nose, a sharp, stinging reminder. Ghosts didn't feel frostbite. Ghosts didn't shiver. She was alive. She was warm meat in a cold freezer. She focused on the reticle of her eyes, the center of her vision. She placed it on the gap between two birch trees across the clearing. That was the kill box. That was the stage. She waited for the actor. She waited for the curtain to rise. But the curtain was made of snow, and the stage was empty, and the audience was a single, freezing girl. The loop of the story continued. Cold, silence, snow, breath, wood, steel. It was a rosary of sensation counted bead by bead. The morning was endless. The light was stagnant. The world was white and gray and blue, and she was the stone in the middle of it all. The sun, if it could be said to exist at all in this hemisphere of shadow, had reached its zenith. There was no golden triumph of noon, no vertical casting of light that banished the darkness. Instead, the day merely settled into a thick, uniform suspension of gray. The charcoal sketch of the forest had been smudged by a heavy thumb, blurring the distinct lines of the morning into a continuous, hazy gradient. The contrast was low, the definition poor. It was a world viewed through a sheet of tracing paper, or seen at the bottom of a deep, frozen lake. The light was omnipresent but weak, a diffuse radiation that seemed to emanate from the snow itself rather than the sky, casting a spectral, underlit glow on the undersides of the pine branches. She lay in the center of this flat, shadowless sphere, a prisoner of the ambient light. The lack of distinct shadows was disorienting. Without the black pools of shade to anchor the eye, the depth perception collapsed. The trees 50 meters away looked as though they were painted on the same plane as the trees 10 meters away. The clearing was a vertical wall of white, not a horizontal field. It required a conscious, cognitive effort to interpret the three-dimensional space, to force the brain to read the subtle cues of texture and size rather than the easy language of light and shadow. The mind worked harder in this flat light, processing the raw data of the visual cortex with a grinding, mechanical slowness. Her body had achieved a state of calcification. The initial discomfort of the cold and the hardness of the ground had passed into a phase of deep, structural rigidity. She felt less like a human being made of muscle and blood, and more like a geological feature, a ridge of stone covered in moss and snow. The separation between her physical form and the environment was dissolving. The wool of her coat felt like the bark of the trees. The felt of her boots felt like the compressed earth. The moisture of her breath felt like the mist. She was losing the definition of her own perimeter. It was a terrifying and seductive sensation, the feeling of disappearing into the landscape, of becoming indistinguishable from the inanimate matter that surrounded her. The rifle, the Mosin Nagant, remained the only object of sharp focus. In the diffuse light, the metal took on a flat, leaden color, devoid of shine. The frost that had coated the barrel in the morning had thickened, forming a crust that looked like white rust. She studied the texture of this frost. It was not a uniform coating. It was a collection of millions of individual structures, tiny towers and bridges of ice that had grown in the silence. Near the muzzle, where the metal was thickest, the frost was dense and opaque. Near the wooden stock, where the thermal conductivity changed, the frost was thinner, translucent, revealing the dark blue of the steel beneath. It was a map of thermodynamics, a visual representation of the heat transfer between the weapon and the world. She focused on the bolt handle. It was a simple, brutal piece of engineering, a sphere of steel on a stalk bent at a sharp angle. It was the interface between the operator and the mechanism. It was the handle she would grab to cycle the action, to eject the spent casing and chamber the new round. She imagined the sensation of the steel through the mitten, the resistance of the spring, the slide of the bolt in the receiver, the chaotic tumble of the brass. The imagination was a rehearsal. She rehearsed the movement 1,000 times in the stillness of her mind, keeping the neural pathways greased even as the muscles cooled. The scope was covered by leather caps tied together with a thin leather thong. The leather was old, cracked, dried by the cold. It had a dark, rich color like peat. She looked at the knot in the thong. It was a simple overhand knot, tight and hard. The leather fibers were frayed at the ends, frozen stiff. The caps protected the glass lenses from the snow and the condensation. They were the eyelids of the rifle. To see, she would have to remove them. To remove them, she would have to move. So she kept the rifle blind, trusting her own eyes to watch the sector. The scope was for the final moment, the moment of precision. The naked eye was for the hours of endurance. The air had a texture. It was not empty space. It was a suspension of ice dust, a glittery, abrasive medium. When she inhaled, she could feel the grit of the cold in her throat. It was a dry, metallic taste like licking a frozen coin. The moisture in her mouth was thick and tacky. She ran her tongue over her teeth. They felt cold, smooth, like pebbles in a stream. The inside of her mouth was the only warm place in the universe, a small cave of heat protected by the lips and the scarf. She guarded this heat jealously, breathing through her nose to trap the moisture, keeping her mouth shut against the thief of the wind. The silence of the midday was heavy, oppressive. The morning birds had gone silent. The wind had settled into a sullen stillness. The trees stood motionless, paralyzed by the cold. In this vacuum, the ringing in her ears became a symphony. It was a high-pitched, constant tone, a carrier wave of the nervous system. It shifted in pitch sometimes, dropping to a lower hum, then rising again to a mosquito whine. It was the sound of silence itself, the auditory hallucination of a brain starved for input. She listened to the ringing. She modulated it with her breath. Inhale, the pitch rose. Exhale, the pitch fell. It was a private music, a concert for an audience of one. Her knees were the points of greatest suffering. Even through the quilted trousers and the wool underlayers, the pressure of the frozen earth was relentless. The cold had seeped through the fabric, turning the skin of her kneecaps into blocks of ice. The pain was a dull, rusted ache, a feeling of deep bruising. She imagined the fluid in the joints turning to gel, the cartilage hardening into bone. She wanted to shift, to roll onto her side, to relieve the pressure for just a minute. The urge was a physical hunger. But she did not move. To move was to break the camouflage. To move was to reveal the shape of the human among the shapes of the wood. She offered the pain up to the mission. She visualized the pain as a color, a dark, throbbing purple, and pushed it to the back of her mind. The snow in front of her face was a landscape of infinite detail. In the flat light, the crystals lost their sparkle and became grains of gray sand. She looked at a small depression, a hoof print or a paw print from days ago, now softened by fresh snow. It was a cup of shadow, a pool of slightly darker gray in the field of white. Inside the depression, the snow was arranged in a swirling pattern, evidence of a micro-vortex of wind. She traced the lines of the swirl. It was a fingerprint of the atmosphere. It was a record of a gust of wind that had existed for 3 seconds on a Tuesday, frozen forever in the ice. She counted the layers of her clothing mentally, a checklist of insulation. Against the skin, the linen shift, rough and dry. Over that, the woolen tunic, scratchy and dense. Over that, the quilted jacket, the telegraphica, filled with cotton batting. Over the legs, the woolen stockings, the quilted breeches. On the feet, the foot wraps, the felt boots. On the hands, the woolen liners, the canvas mittens. On the head, the woolen cap, the scarf. It was a fortress of fabric. A soft armor against the hard element. She could feel the weight of it, a heavy, constricting embrace. It limited her range of motion. It made her clumsy, but it kept the fire burning. The wind shifted again, a subtle rotation of the air mass. It brought with it a smell, not the clean smell of pine and snow, but something else, faint, earthy, smoke. No, not smoke. It was the smell of decomposition, of wet wood and rotting leaves. It was the smell of a swamp carried from miles away by the currents of the atmosphere. It was a reminder that beneath the snow, the earth was still there, dormant, waiting. The smell was incongruous in the sterile, frozen world. It was a scent of life and death, organic and messy. She sniffed the air, flaring her nostrils slightly. The scent vanished as quickly as it had arrived, replaced by the sterile neutrality of the ice. Her eyes began to play tricks on her again. The vintage-colored pencil aesthetic of the world intensified. The trees seemed to vibrate, their dark outlines shimmering against the gray background. The snow seemed to flow like a slow river, a white glacier moving imperceptibly to the left. She blinked hard, resetting the optic nerve. The movement stopped. The world snapped back into static rigidity. It was the Gansfeld effect, the blindness of the open field. The brain, bored by the lack of visual stimuli, began to invent motion. She had to remain vigilant against her own mind. She had to trust the stillness. A beetle, black and armored, lay on its back in the snow near the birch tree. It was dead, frozen in a posture of struggle, its legs curled tight against its body. It was a tiny black dot in the vastness. She looked at it with a sense of kinship. It had tried to cross the expanse. It had failed. The cold had been faster than its legs. It was a monument to failure, a warning. She wondered how long it had been there. Days? Weeks? In this freezer it would last forever. It would not rot. It would simply dehydrate, becoming a hollow shell, a husk of chitin. She was a husk of wool and skin. The difference was the spark, the metabolic fire that she tended with the breath. The hunger was a hollow cave in her center. It was no longer a sensation of the stomach, but a sensation of the blood. She felt light, airy. Her thoughts were clear, crystalline, detached. The lack of glucose was stripping away the emotional layers, leaving only the logical core. She analyzed the sector with a cold, mathematical precision. Distance to the tree line, 240 meters. Windage, negligible. Elevation, 0. Temperature, -25. The variables were set. The equation was ready. Only the variable of the target was missing. She thought of the target, not as a person, not as a man with a face and a mother, but as a shape, a silhouette, a disruption in the pattern, a vertical line that moved. To think of the target as human was a liability. It invited hesitation. It invited empathy. Empathy was heat, and heat was lost energy. She needed to be cold. She needed to be a mechanism. The rifle was the tool, and she was the mount. The trigger was the switch. The bullet was the message. The light began to shift subtly, the gray deepening by a fraction. The afternoon was beginning to lean towards evening, though noon had barely passed. The winter days were short, a brief interlude of gray between the two darknesses. The psychological weight of the approaching night began to press on her. Night was the time of the wolf, the time of the unseen, the time when the cold became a predator rather than an environment. She dreaded the night, but she accepted it. It was inevitable. The planet turned, and the shadow fell. She focused on the texture of the birch bark again. The peeling strips were like scrolls of ancient paper covered in dash-like markings. She tried to read them like a language, dash dot dash, Morse code from the tree. What was it saying? Endure, endure, endure. It was a simple message. The tree had stood here for 50 years. It had seen blizzards that buried the forest. It had seen fires. It had seen wolves and bears and men. It stood. It waited. It did not complain. She took strength from the birch. She would be wood. She would be root and bark. A sudden sound, a soft whoosh, startled her. A clump of snow, dislodged by nothing more than gravity, slid from a high branch of a spruce tree and fell to the ground. It exploded on impact, sending a cloud of white powder into the air. The powder drifted slowly like smoke, settling over the area. It was a small avalanche, a miniature catastrophe in the insect world. She watched the cloud dissipate. It was a beautiful, silent event, physics in action, gravity and friction and air resistance. Her breathing had become so shallow it was almost imperceptible. She was sipping the air, taking small, efficient drafts that disturbed the scarf as little as possible. The ice on the scarf was thick now, a hard mask that covered the lower half of her face. It was fused to the wool of her collar. She was encased in her own exhalations. To drink from her flask now would require breaking this seal, cracking the ice mask. It would be a violent, noisy act. She decided to wait. The thirst was manageable. The noise was not. The numbness in her feet was a solid fact. She could no longer feel the toes or the ball of the foot. The sensation ended at the arch. It was as if her feet had been amputated and replaced with wooden prosthetics. She knew intellectually that they were still there. She knew that if she moved them, the blood would return with agonizing pins and needles. But for now, they were gone. She accepted this loss. It was the price of admission. She scanned the clearing again. The snow was a textured white blanket, rumpled and creased. She looked for the tells. The straight line of a ski track, the disturbance of a crawl, the glint of metal, the puff of steam. Nothing. The world was empty. It was a stage set for a play that had been canceled. But she could not leave the theater. She had to stay in her seat, watching the empty curtain just in case the actors arrived. The color of the sky was merging with the color of the earth. The horizon was vanishing completely. It was a whiteout of gray. Up was down, down was up. She felt a moment of vertigo, a spinning sensation as the inner ear lost its reference points. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds, grounding herself with the feeling of gravity pressing her chest against the ground. I am here. The ground is down. The sky is up. She opened her eyes. The vertigo passed, leaving a lingering nausea. She focused on the mental image of a candle, a single white wax candle with a steady yellow flame. She placed this image in the center of her mind. It was a point of focus, a source of imaginary heat. She visualized the wax melting, pooling, running down the side. She visualized the blue heart of the flame. She used this image to keep the mind from freezing. The brain needed an anchor. The candle was the anchor. The wind sighed, a long, drawn-out exhalation that rustled the dry needles of the deadfall nearby. It sounded like a whisper. Hush. It was the voice of the snow. It was telling her to sleep, to close her eyes, to let go. The snow was a soft bed. The cold was a warm blanket if you waited long enough. It was the siren song of hypothermia. She recognized the melody. She rejected it. She sharpened her gaze. She clenched her jaw. Not yet. She looked at the strap of the rifle. It was canvas, green-gray, stiff as a board. It was looped through the metal swivels. The weave of the canvas was visible, a crosshatch pattern of threads. Some of the threads were frayed, standing up like tiny hairs. They were white with frost. The strap was frozen in a curve, suspended in the air where it didn't touch the ground. It looked like a sculpture of a strap. The waiting continued. A slow, heavy hydraulic pressure. Minute by minute, the grain of the snow, the gray of the sky, the ache of the bone, the silence. The sniper girl lay in the white snow, a breathing stone, a watching ice, a sentinel of the void. The day was a long, gray tunnel, and she was halfway through, crawling on her belly without moving an inch. The afternoon had settled into a state of permanent, suspended animation. The light, which had never truly arrived, was already beginning the slow, imperceptible retreat towards the horizon. The sky was a vast sheet of unbleached paper, a heavy, fibrous gray that seemed to absorb the world below rather than illuminate it. The vintage-colored pencil aesthetic of the forest deepened. The strokes of charcoal that defined the tree trunks became heavier, darker, more emphatic. The delicate pastel shading of the snow turned a shade cooler, shifting from the dirty white of midday to a bruised, blue-gray tone that signaled the approaching drop in temperature. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming a tangible medium that pressed against the eardrums and settled into the lungs like a cold, heavy fluid. She lay at the center of this thickening atmosphere, a fossil embedded in the strata of the winter. Her connection to the physical world had reduced to a series of pressure points. The elbows, the knees, the hip bones, the ribs. These were the anchors that held her to the earth, the places where the weight of her body compressed the layers of wool and cotton against the frozen ground. The sensation in these points had passed from pain to a dull, hydraulic numbness, as if the nerves had simply ceased to transmit the signal of discomfort. She existed as a mind floating inside a shell of stiffened fabric, a ghost haunting a suit of armor made of felt and canvas. The snow in her immediate field of vision had lost all semblance of softness. In the flat, deteriorating light, it looked like a landscape of concrete dust, hard and abrasive. The tiny ridges and valleys of the drift surface were frozen solid, fixed in place by the wind and the cold. She studied a single square inch of this surface, directly beneath the handguard of the rifle. It was a chaotic jumble of ice grains fused together. Some were clear as glass, others opaque as milk. There was a tiny piece of bark trapped in the ice, a fragment of the tree above. It was dark brown, almost black with a rough, serrated edge. It looked ancient, like a relic from a time before the Ice Age. She focused on this piece of bark. It was her entire universe for a measure of time that had no name. The silence was absolute, yet filled with the phantom sounds of the physiology. The blood rushing through the carotid artery was a roaring river in her ears. The slow, rhythmic thump of the heart was a drum beat in the center of her chest. The creaking of the cartilage in her neck when she made a microscopic adjustment was the sound of a heavy door opening on rusty hinges. These internal sounds were deafening against the backdrop of the silent woods. They were the machinery of life, grinding on in a place built for death. She listened to them with a detached curiosity, as if monitoring the engine of a vehicle she was merely a passenger in. The cold was no longer an external aggressor. It was an internal condition. It had seeped past the defenses of the wool, past the air gaps, past the skin, and settled into the deep tissues. Her muscles felt dense, slow, like clay that had been left out in the frost. To move a finger required a deliberate, forceful command from the brain. The signal had to travel down the neural pathways, fighting through the resistance of the cold to trigger the chemical reaction in the muscle fibers. She tested this connection periodically. A twitch of the thumb against the stock of the rifle, a flex of the gluteal muscles, a flare of the nostrils, small confirmations that the machine was still operational, however sluggish. Her breath had created a complex structure of ice on the scarf. The moisture from her exhalations had condensed and frozen, building layer upon layer of frost until the fabric was stiff as a board. It formed a localized cave around her mouth and nose, a microenvironment of humidity and warmth that was instantly destroyed the moment it escaped into the outside air. The ice crystals on the outside of the scarf were long and needle-like, growing outward like a beard of frost. When she inhaled, the fabric pressed against her lips, cold and wet. When she exhaled, it pushed away slightly. It was a respirator of ice, filtering the world through frozen wool. The visual field was static, a painting that refused to change. The birch tree with the peeling bark, the dark grouping of pines, the clearing with its undulating drifts. It was a scene of relentless monotony. The brain, starved for novelty, began to heighten the perception of texture. The rough weave of the rifle strap looked like a landscape of braided ropes. The grain of the wooden stock looked like a topographical map of a brown planet. The scratch on the metal receiver looked like a canyon. She zoomed in on these details, losing herself in the fractals of the ordinary. It was a way to compress time, to make the hours collapse into moments of intense scrutiny. The wind began to stir again, a low, moaning draft that moved through the undergrowth. It did not shake the trees this time. It slithered along the ground, picking up loose crystals of snow and carrying them in low, serpentine streams. Snake snow. It hissed as it moved, a dry, sibilant sound like sand blowing across paper. She watched the streams of snow flow past her elbows, flowing around the obstruction of her body like water around a rock. They filled the small depression she had made, burying her deeper. She was being erased. The wind was smoothing over the anomaly of her presence, returning the forest to its pristine state. She welcomed the camouflage. Let the snow cover the green of the helmet. Let the snow cover the dark of the boots. Let her become white. She thought of the rifle bolt. The metal was cold enough to burn. If she were to touch it with her tongue, the flesh would freeze instantly, fused to the steel. It was a trap, a dangerous object, yet it was also the key. The firing pin inside the bolt was a coiled spring holding potential energy. It was the only thing in this vicinity that had the potential for speed, for heat, for violence. It was a dormant volcano. She respected the mechanism. She visualized the interior of the chamber. The brass cartridge case, cold and smooth. The powder inside, dry and granular. The primer, a tiny cup of fulminate waiting for the strike. It was a package of chemistry waiting for physics. The hunger had changed again. It was no longer a hollowness, but a faint nausea, a dizziness that sat at the base of the skull. The blood sugar was low. The brain was rationing glucose. Thoughts came slower now. They were less complex. Simple sentences: cold, wait, white, tree. The complex narratives of the past, the memories of home, the justifications for the war, these were too expensive to maintain. They faded into the background noise. Only the immediate sensory data remained relevant. The texture of the snow, the sound of the wind, the feeling of the ice. She directed her gaze to the far side of the clearing, to the wall of trees that marked the limit of her world. The shadows between the trunks were deepening, turning from gray to a rich, velvety black. The vintage pastel drawing was being shaded in with a heavier hand. The contrast was increasing. This was good. Contrast meant targets were visible. In the flat light of noon, everything blended. In the directional light of the late afternoon, shapes detached themselves from the background. She scanned the shadows. A stump looked like a crouching man. A broken branch looked like a leveled rifle. She interrogated each shape with her eyes. Are you him? No, you are wood. You are dead. The fatigue of the eyes was a physical weight. The eyelids felt like lead shutters. They wanted to close. They wanted to shut out the relentless white and gray. To keep them open was an act of will, a muscular exertion that burned in the forehead. She blinked deliberately, a slow, hydraulic motion. 1, 2, open. The tear film froze on the lashes, gluing them together for a split second. The act of seeing was a struggle against the elements. A crow called out, a harsh caw-caw that echoed flatly in the heavy air. It was a sound devoid of melody, a raw, functional signal. It came from somewhere behind her, from the depths of the forest she could not see. She did not turn her head. To turn was to break the stillness. To turn was to make a sound. She relied on her hearing to track the bird. The sound of wings flapping, whoop whoop whoop, moved from left to right, high above. The bird was passing over. It was a traveler in the sky, looking down at the frozen statue in the snow. Did it see her? Did it distinguish the human shape from the drifts? Or was she just another mound of snow? The cold in her feet had progressed. The numbness was total up to the ankles. Above the ankles there was a band of burning pain, the transition zone where the nerves were dying and then reviving in a cycle of agony. It felt like a ring of fire around the shins. She focused on this pain. It was a useful signal. It meant the legs were still there. It meant the blood was still fighting the battle at the frontier. She imagined the warm, red blood pushing against the blue wall of the cold. It was a trench war fought in the capillaries. The sky above began to exhibit a subtle texture, a mottling of the gray cloud deck. It looked like curdled milk or the surface of a rough stone. The uniformity was breaking down as the light angle changed. A faint, lighter patch appeared in the west, the ghost of the sun trying to push through the layers of vapor. It cast no warmth, only a slightly pearlescent glow that made the snow look even colder. It was a winter sun, a pale imitation of the star that burned in summer. It was a light without heat, a decoration in the sky. She became aware of the texture of the wool underwear against her skin. It was itchy, rough, a constant low-level irritation. In the beginning, it had been annoying. Now it was a comfort, it was a sensation. It was a tactile proof of existence. The friction of the wool when she breathed, the slight rub against the ribs, it was a reminder of the boundary between self and world. If she could feel the wool, she was not yet ice. The smell of the forest shifted as the temperature dropped. The sharp resin scent of the pines receded, locked away in the frozen bark. In its place came the smell of ozone, of pure, distilled cold. It was a metallic, sterile scent, the smell of the upper atmosphere descending to the earth. It smelled like electricity. It smelled like silence. She flared her nostrils, taking in the scent of the void. It was clean. It was pure. It was deadly. The rifle strap hung in a perfect catenary curve, a parabola of canvas. She studied the geometry of it. Gravity was the artist here. It pulled the heavy fabric down, creating a shape of perfect mathematical balance. The frost on the strap made it look white, blending it with the snow. The rifle was disappearing. The wood was darkening, the metal was whitening. It was becoming a hybrid object, half machine, half winter. Her mind drifted to the concept of 24 hours. It was an arbitrary construct. The earth rotated, the light came and went. But here in the snow, time was not circular, it was linear, it was a straight line of endurance. Hour 10 was harder than hour 1. Hour 20 would be harder than hour 10. The cold was cumulative. It stored itself in the body, a debt that could not be paid. She was accumulating a deficit of heat that would take days to repay. If she survived. The word "if" floated in her mind. It was a dangerous word. It implied doubt. She crushed it. There was no if. There was only when. When the target appears, when the shot is taken, when the extraction begins, when the tea is poured, certainty was a weapon. Doubt was a crack in the armor where the cold could get in. She sealed the crack with repetition. Wait, watch, endure. A small animal, perhaps a vole or a mouse, tunneled beneath the snow near her left hand. She could hear the tiny, frantic scratching sound, scritch, scritch, transmitted through the ground. It was moving just inches below the surface in the subnivean zone, the space between the ground and the snowpack where the temperature was slightly warmer. It was a whole other world down there, a dark, narrow world of tunnels and roots. She envied the mouse. It had a roof. It had walls. She was exposed to the infinite sky. The light continued to fail. The vintage-colored pencil drawing was being darkened. The artist was switching to a softer, blacker charcoal. The blue tones were becoming purple. The gray tones were becoming slate. The visibility was shrinking. The far tree line was now a solid black wall, a silhouette without detail. The middle distance was a gray haze. Only the immediate foreground remained distinct. The world was closing in. She felt a shudder ripple through her torso, a violent, involuntary spasm of the core muscles. It shook her frame, rattling the rifle against her shoulder. It was the body screaming for heat, generating kinetic energy in a desperate attempt to warm the blood. She clamped down on it. She tightened the abdominals, the pectorals, the lats. She forced the muscles into isometric stillness. Stop. The shuddering subsided, leaving her breathless and weak. It was a warning. The core temperature was dropping. The furnace was running low on fuel. She visualized a small coal burning in her stomach, a single red-hot ember of anthracite. She focused all her mental energy on blowing on this ember. Glow, burn, heat. She imagined the warmth spreading out from the center, radiating to the spine, to the heart. It was a visualization technique, a trick of the mind to fool the body. It worked slightly. The panic of the cold receded. The ember glowed. The wind picked up a handful of snow and threw it against the scope caps. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was sharp, brittle. The ice crystals stuck to the leather, adding another layer to the blindfold. She did not brush them off. The buildup was good. It broke up the outline. It made the rifle look like a stick. Camouflage was a process of accumulation. Let the winter bury the weapon. It would still fire. She looked at the fingers of her right hand. They were curled inside the mitten, the trigger finger isolated in its own stall. She could not feel the tip of the trigger finger. It was a numb object. She rubbed it against the thumb inside the wool. Friction. Rub, rub. A faint ghost of sensation returned, enough to feel the trigger. She hoped so. The trigger pull on the Mosin was heavy, a long, creeping pull before the break. She didn't need delicate touch. She needed brute force and timing. The finger was a hook. The arm was the lever. The gray of the sky was now matching the gray of the snow. The horizon was completely gone. She was floating in a sphere of gray. There was no up, no down, only the pressure of gravity to tell her which way the earth lay. The vertigo returned, a spinning sensation that made her grip the ground with her elbows. She stared at the pine cone. Anchor. The pine cone was real. The pine cone was down. The dizziness passed. The silence seemed to deepen with the darkening light. It became a heavy, physical substance like water. It filled the spaces between the trees. It dampened the sound of the wind. It was a silence that listened. It was waiting for a mistake, a cough, a sneeze, a shift of equipment. She gave it nothing. She was a void in the silence, a blank spot in the audio spectrum. Her thoughts turned to the concept of the White Death, the name the enemy gave to the snipers. It was a romantic name. There was nothing romantic about this. It was wet wool and frozen snot and numbness and boredom. It was the slow calcification of the joints. It was the reduction of a human being to a biological sensor. But there was a purity to it, a simplicity. No politics, no speeches, just the physics of ballistics and the biology of survival. The light was now definitely evening light. The blue hour was returning, but darker this time, heavier. The shadows were stretching out, long, distorted fingers reaching across the snow. The birch tree cast a shadow that looked like a jagged scar on the white surface. The texture of the snow became exaggerated, every ripple and bump casting a long shadow. The ground looked rough, broken. The smooth blanket of noon was gone. She prepared herself for the night. The night was the test. The temperature would drop another 10 degrees. The wind would rise. The darkness would be total. She checked her internal resources. Willpower 60%. Physical energy 40%. Heat reserves critical. It would be a close thing. But she was the sniper girl. She was the winter. She would not break. She took a slow breath, inhaling the darkening air. It tasted of night. It tasted of iron. She exhaled a cloud of gray steam that merged with the shadows. She settled deeper into the mold of the snow. She became the stone. She became the ice. She waited. The transition from the gray afternoon to the deep, resonant indigo of the evening was not an event, but a geological process of light decaying into shadow. The world did not simply darken. It changed its fundamental density. The air, previously a suspended medium of ice dust and pale light, seemed to coagulate, turning into a heavy, viscous fluid that pressed against the earth with a physical weight. The vintage-colored pencil, aesthetic of the visual field, shifted its palette entirely. The soft, smudged grays of the day were overwritten by heavy, aggressive strokes of midnight blue and charcoal black. The artist of the winter was pressing harder on the paper, filling in the voids between the trees with solid blocks of darkness, leaving only the faintest, ghostly outlines of the drifts to define the ground. She lay at the bottom of this deepening ocean of shadow, a solitary anchor in a world that was rapidly losing its form. The visibility, which had been a generous corridor of a few hundred meters, collapsed inwards. The tree line at the far end of the clearing vanished first, consumed by the rising tide of the night. Then the individual trees in the middle distance merged into a single, serrated wall of blackness. Finally, the world was reduced to the immediate radius of her own position. The mound of snow she lay upon, the trunk of the birch tree to her left, and the dark, icy length of the rifle barrel stretching out before her. The cold underwent a chemical change. During the day, it had been a dry, static presence. Now, with the loss of the ambient solar radiation, it became active, predatory. It developed teeth. She could feel the temperature dropping by the minute, a slide into the abyss of the thermometer. The air grew sharper, more brittle. Every inhalation was a scouring of the throat with steel wool. The moisture in her nose froze instantly, the tiny hairs stiffening and clicking together with each breath. The skin on her face, exposed around the edges of the goggles and the scarf, felt tight, as if it were shrinking, pulling away from the bone. It was the sensation of parchment drying in a kiln, but the kiln was made of ice. Her body, encased in its layers of wool and felt, fought a silent, desperate war of thermodynamics. The heat generated by her internal organs, the slow burn of the liver, the rhythmic pump of the heart, was a fortress under siege. The cold attacked the seams of her clothing, the zippers, the buttonholes. It sought out the points of compression where the insulation was crushed against the ground. Her elbows and knees were no longer parts of her body. They were foreign objects, blocks of frozen wood attached to her limbs. She could feel the cold radiating up from the earth, a relentless, conductive chill that bypassed the air and struck directly at the skeleton. The silence of the evening was profound, a vacuum that sucked the thoughts out of her head. The wind had died completely, leaving the forest in a state of suspended animation. There was no rustle of branches, no hiss of drifting snow. There was only the ringing in her ears, the high-frequency whine of the nervous system operating in a sensory void. It was a loud silence, a deafening absence of noise. She focused on the sound of her own blood. Whoosh thud, whoosh thud. It was a slow, hydraulic rhythm, the sound of a machine running on its lowest setting, conserving fuel, keeping the pilot light barely flickering. Visually, the snow had transformed. In the daylight, it had been a textured white surface. Now, under the heavy indigo of the twilight, it was a luminous blue substance, glowing with a faint, spectral phosphorescence. It absorbed the last dregs of the light and held them, radiating a cold, ghostly energy. The crystals were no longer distinct grains. They were a smooth, matte wash of blue pastel, rubbed into the dark grain of the paper. The shadows cast by the smallest irregularities, a twig, a ridge of ice, were absolute black, holes in the reality of the snow. She stared at these shadows. They were portals to the void. They were the places where the world ended. Her eyes, straining against the gathering darkness, began to manufacture shapes. The pareidolia effect was strong in the low light. A stump became a crouching soldier. A hanging branch became a waving hand. A patch of dark bark became a face. She did not startle. She knew these ghosts. They were the projections of a bored and anxious mind. She tested them with a simple logic. Do they move? Do they breathe? Do they emit heat? The ghosts remained static, frozen in their charcoal outlines. They were hallucinations of the retina, tricks of the rod cells trying to make sense of the gloom. She dismissed them, blinking slowly to clear the slate of her vision. The rifle was now a black silhouette against the dark blue snow. The frost on the barrel had ceased to be white and had taken on the color of the night. It was a dark, fuzzy texture like mold growing on the steel. The weapon felt heavier, as if the darkness itself had mass and was piling up on the metal. She adjusted her grip on the stock, a movement of millimeters. The wood was cold, lifeless. The oil finish was tacky, frozen into a semi-solid state. Her mitten adhered slightly to the stock, a dry, sticky bond. She did not pull it free. She let the hand and the rifle merge. The hunger in her stomach had evolved into a dull, rhythmic cramp. It was the body's digestive system protesting the emptiness, a slow contraction of the stomach lining. She ignored it. It was irrelevant data. The body was a vehicle. It required maintenance, yes, but in the field it ran on reserves. She visualized the fat stores in her body being unlocked, the chemical energy being released into the bloodstream. She was consuming herself to stay warm. It was a cannibalistic process, a necessary sacrifice. She was burning the furniture to keep the house warm. She thought of the concept of waiting. It was not a passive act, it was a muscular verb. To wait was to hold a heavy weight above one's head. To wait was to keep a bowstring drawn. It required tension, focus, discipline. The mind wanted to wander to escape the cold and the dark. It wanted to think of a stove, a cat, a book. She reeled it back in. Stay here, stay in the snow, stay in the cold. The discipline was a leash. She kept the mind short-leashed, tethered to the iron stake of the mission. The sky above was a heavy, oppressive lid. The clouds had thickened, sealing off the stars, sealing off the moon. There would be no celestial navigation tonight. There would be no comforting glitter of the cosmos. There was only the cloud deck, a ceiling of dark gray wool that reflected the cold back down to the earth. It was a closed system, a box of freezing air. She felt the claustrophobia of the open forest. It was a paradox. The space was infinite, yet she felt trapped in a small, cold room. A single snowflake fell, landing on the bridge of her nose. It did not melt. Her skin was too cold. It sat there, a tiny, icy kiss. She crossed her eyes to look at it. It was a blurred white speck. It tickled. The sensation was maddening. She wanted to brush it off. She wanted to scratch the itch, but movement was death. Movement was betrayal. She twitched her nose, a rabbit-like motion. The flake slid down, lodging in the weave of the scarf. Crisis averted. The discipline held. The darkness brought a new sense of smell. The air smelled of ancient things. It smelled of the deep earth, of roots that had slumbered for centuries, of rocks that had been ground by glaciers. It was a mineral scent, cold and hard. It was the smell of time stopping. She breathed it in, letting the cold air fill the bottom of her lungs. It cooled the blood in the alveoli. She imagined the cold blood traveling to her heart, chilling the core. She countered it with the visualization of the ember. The ember was smaller now, a tiny red spark in a pile of gray ash. She blew on it mentally. Burn, burn. The sound of a tree cracking in the distance was sharper now, louder in the dense air. Crack. It sounded like a bone breaking. It was the sound of the forest suffering. The sap was freezing, expanding, splitting the wood. It was a violent internal destruction. She felt a sympathy for the trees. They could not move. They could not dress in wool. They simply stood and took the frost. She was like them. She was a tree with a rifle. Her legs were losing the battle. The sensation in the thighs was fading, retreating towards the groin. The knees were gone. The shins were gone. The feet were a distant memory. She knew they were there only because of the weight of the boots. She tried to send a signal to the toes. Wiggle. Nothing. The line was down. The telegraph wires were cut by the storm. She didn't panic. Panic increased the heart rate, which burned energy. She accepted the numbness. It was a form of anesthesia. If she had to move, she would move on wooden stumps. It had been done before. The vintage-colored pencil style of the world was now dominated by the black charcoal. The artist was shading everything in. The clearing was a pool of ink. The trees were pillars of soot. The only light was the faint, bluish luminescence of the snow itself, a stored memory of the day. It was enough to see the crosshairs of the reticle in her mind, if not in the scope. She projected the crosshairs onto the darkness, vertical line, horizontal line, intersection, the target point. She began to count the breaths. It was a way to measure the passage of the night. Inhale 1, exhale 2, inhale 3, exhale 4. The rhythm was slow, hypnotic. It was a lullaby. She had to be careful not to count herself to sleep. She set a rule: every 100th breath she would open her eyes wide and scan the sector. 98, 99, 100, open. The eyes strained against the gloom. The dark shapes were still there. The silence was still there. Close. 1, 2, 3. It was a ritual of vigilance. The scarf around her mouth had become a solid mask of ice. It was heavy, pulling down on her face. The moisture had soaked into the wool and frozen hard. It was like wearing a muzzle of concrete. She could feel the rough texture of the ice against her lips. If she moved her jaw, the ice cracked with a tiny, sharp sound. K-R-Rick. She minimized the movement. She breathed shallowly, recycling the air in the small pocket between her mouth and the mask. It was a hypoxic environment, low in oxygen, high in carbon dioxide. It made her head feel light, floaty. It contributed to the dreamlike state of the freeze. The wind returned, a sudden sharp gust from the north. It cut through the layers of her clothing as if they were gauze. It found the gap at the back of her neck between the helmet and the collar. It was a knife of ice sliding down her spine. She shuddered, a violent, full-body spasm that rattled the rifle against the ground. The shuddering was painful. It woke up the dormant muscles, forcing them to contract. It generated a burst of heat, but at a high cost. She clamped down, fighting the reflex. Still. Be still. The wind passed, leaving her shivering and colder than before. She thought of the enemy. He was out there, somewhere in the black wall of the trees. Was he watching? Was he shivering? Did he have a flask of vodka? Did he have a picture of a girl in his pocket? These thoughts were dangerous humanizations. She stripped them away. He was a target. He was a silhouette. He was a heat signature. He was the reason she was freezing. If he appeared, she would kill him. Not out of hatred, but out of necessity, to end the waiting, to earn the warmth. The darkness was now total. The blue hour had ended. The world was black and gray. The only way to see was to use the rod cells in the periphery of the vision. To look directly at something was to make it disappear. She had to look to the side of the trees to see the trees. It was a world of averted vision. A world of secrets. She felt a phantom sensation of warmth on her left hand. It felt like someone was holding it. It was a comforting, gentle heat. She knew it was a lie. It was the nerves misfiring, the final stage before total loss of sensation. The paradoxical undressing phase was a risk. The brain, confused by the cold, would signal that the body was overheating. Men had been found frozen to death, naked in the snow, their clothes folded neatly beside them. She recognized the symptom. My hand is not warm. My hand is freezing. Do not take off the mitten. She repeated the mantra, do not take off the mitten. The texture of the ground beneath her seemed to grow harder. The earth was rejecting her. It was pushing back against her ribs, against her hip bones. The snow was no longer a cushion. It was a bed of nails. Every minute point of contact was a bruise. She shifted her weight microscopically, trying to find a softer arrangement of ice crystals. There was none. The world was hard. The world was cold. The world was indifferent. She focused on the sound of the wind in the pine needles. It had a specific pitch, a high, sibilant hiss. SSSSSS. It sounded like a snake. It sounded like gas escaping a valve. It was the friction of air against matter. She tried to isolate the sound of a single branch moving. She imagined the needles vibrating. She imagined the wood bending. It was a way to focus the hearing, to tune the radar. A shadow detached itself from the tree line. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Thud, thud, thud. She froze her breath. She widened her eyes. The shadow moved again. It was low to the ground. It was fluid. A fox, a wolf, a man crawling. She tracked it. It moved across the snow, darker than the darkness. It stopped near the birch tree. It raised its head. A pair of eyes reflected the faint ambient light, tiny green pinpricks. A fox. It sniffed the air. It looked in her direction. It did not see her. It saw a mound of snow. It trotted away, disappearing into the gloom. She exhaled. The adrenaline washed out of her system, leaving her exhausted. The adrenaline dump left her colder. The chemical fire had burned bright for a second, then vanished. Now the ash was cold. She felt the chill settling deeper into her core. She needed to generate heat. She performed the isometric squeeze. She tensed every muscle in her legs, her arms, her back, her stomach. She held the tension for 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. She released. A wave of faint warmth washed through the tissues. It was a manual pump priming the engine. She did it again. Tense, hold, release. It was the only exercise allowed in the prison of the drift. The sky began to clear, just a fraction. A tear appeared in the cloud deck, a jagged rip in the gray wool. Through the tear she saw a single star. It was incredibly bright, a diamond chip on black velvet. It pulsed with a cold, blue-white light. It looked sharp, distant, uncaring. It was a sun, burning billions of miles away, but it offered no heat here. It only offered perspective. She was a speck on a rock orbiting a star, freezing in the shadow of a cloud. The scale of the universe made her suffering seem insignificant. It was a comforting nihilism. The star vanished as the clouds closed up again. The lid was back on the box. The darkness resumed its absolute reign. She was alone with the snow and the silence. She checked the rifle bolt with her thumb again. Still there, still cold, still shut. The mechanism was ready. The operator was fading, but the mechanism was eternal. Steel did not feel pain. Steel did not get tired. She tried to borrow the properties of the steel. I am iron, I am wood, I am ice. The night stretched out before her, a vast, unmapped continent of time. She had to cross it second by second, breath by breath. There were no shortcuts. There was no fast forward. There was only the endure, the slow, grinding endure. She closed her eyes for a count of 3. The image of the vintage pastel drawing remained on her eyelids, the dark trees, the blue snow, the black shadows. It was burned into her retina. She was becoming the image. She was becoming the art of the freeze. The night had entered its deepest, most subterranean phase. The concept of time had ceased to be a linear progression of hours and had become a static, crushing weight. There was no past, for the memory of warmth was too distant to recall without pain. There was no future, for the dawn seemed an impossible promise, a lie told by the turning of the world. There was only the eternal now, a vast, dark chamber of ice and silence in which she was the sole inhabitant. The vintage-colored pencil aesthetic that had defined the twilight had been obliterated by a heavy hand wielding a stick of pure compressed charcoal. The world was drawn in shades of absolute black, relieved only by the faintest, smudged highlights of midnight blue, where the snow caught the starlight diffusing through the thick cloud deck. It was a drawing made with eyes closed, a tactile landscape of rough paper and heavy, greasy shadows. She lay at the bottom of this well of darkness, a consciousness trapped in a shell of frozen wool. The boundary between her body and the snow had dissolved completely. She no longer felt the cold as an external force pressing against her skin. She felt it as the fundamental substance of her being. Her blood felt thick and sludge-like, moving through her veins with the reluctance of molasses in winter. Her bones felt brittle, like glass rods that would shatter at the slightest impact. The heat of her core was a small, fiercely guarded secret, a flickering candle flame in a cathedral of ice. She visualized this flame constantly, feeding it with the oxygen of her shallow breath, protecting it from the drafts of the night. The silence was no longer empty. It had acquired a texture, a density. It pressed against her ears with the weight of water. In this crushing quiet, the microscopic sounds of the forest were amplified to the volume of thunder. The sound of a pine needle falling and hitting the crust of the snow was a sharp tick that made her heart jump. The sound of the wood contracting in the deep freeze was a groan of agony, a sentient complaint from the trees. Cr-rar-rar-rack. The sound traveled through the frozen ground, vibrating against her ribs. It was the earth itself shivering. She felt a strange solidarity with the trees. They were standing watch just as she was. They were enduring the frost just as she was. They were silent soldiers in a war against the temperature. Her vision was reduced to a grainy, pulsating field of dark gray. The lack of photons caused the retina to fire randomly, creating Eigengrau, the intrinsic gray of the dark. She saw swirling patterns of static, faint flashes of geometric shapes that drifted across her field of view like microscopic organisms. She ignored them. They were the artifacts of a starving optic nerve. Instead, she focused on the true blacks, the solid, unmoving shapes of the tree trunks. They were darker than the darkness, voids in the visual field. She counted them. 1 void, 2 voids, 3 voids. They were the pillars of her prison. The sensation in her hands was a complex study in numbness. The mittens were stiff, frozen into the shape of the rifle stock. Inside, her fingers were curled and immobile. She could not feel the individual digits. She felt a block of flesh, heavy and unresponsive. To check the trigger finger, she had to send a powerful mental command, a shout down the neural pathways. Move. A faint, dull pressure against the wool. It was enough. The mechanism was still connected. The hook was still baited. The rifle, the Mosin Nagant, had become a creature of the night. The metal was indistinguishable from the air. Both were black, both were freezing. The wood of the stock was a slightly warmer texture, but only just. The frost on the barrel had built up into a thick rime coating, jagged and sharp. If she were to slide her hand along the barrel, the ice would cut the wool of her mitten. The rifle was absorbing the night. It was storing the cold in its steel heart. She wondered if the firing pin would even move, or if the grease had turned to glue. She trusted the kerosene. She trusted the simplicity of the design. It was a machine built for this weather, built by people who knew the snow. The air she breathed was a solid object. It entered her nose as a sharp, crystalline solid, cutting the membranes. It filled her lungs with a heavy, sinking cold that seemed to pull the heat straight out of her blood. Every exhalation was a labor, pushing the heavy, carbon dioxide-rich air out through the resistance of the ice mask. The scarf was now a rigid sculpture of ice, fused to her collar, fused to her hat. It was a helmet of frost. Inside, the air was humid, smelling of wet wool and the stale tang of her own exhausted breath. It was a closed loop of respiration. She was breathing her own ghosts. A new sound emerged from the darkness, a soft, rhythmic hiss, hiss, hiss. It was the wind waking up in the upper canopy. It started high, rustling the tops of the tallest spruce trees, knocking loose the snow loads. The snow fell in cascades, invisible in the dark but audible as soft, heavy thumps on the ground. Whump, whump. Whump. It sounded like footsteps, heavy boots walking in deep snow. The paranoia flared, a sudden spike of adrenaline that tasted like copper in her mouth. She froze her breathing. She widened her eyes, staring into the pitch black. She strained her ears, filtering the wind from the thumps. Was there a cadence? Was there a pattern? Whump, pause, whump, pause. No, it was random. It was gravity. It was the snow shedding its weight. She exhaled, the tension leaving her muscles but the cold rushing in to fill the gap. Her mind began to detach from the reality of the situation. It wandered into the hypnagogic state, the borderland between wakefulness and sleep. She found herself thinking of a stove, a large cast-iron stove in a wooden cabin. The iron was glowing cherry red. The heat was radiating out invisible waves, distorting the air. She could smell the burning birch wood. She could feel the heat on her face, melting the frost on her eyelashes. It was a seductive, dangerous hallucination. The body wanted to believe it. The body wanted to let go and sink into that imaginary warmth. She shook her head, a microscopic movement that grated the ice collar against her neck. Pain is truth. The pain of the ice rubbing her skin brought her back. The stove vanished. The cold returned, harder than before. She focused on the texture of the ground beneath her hip bone. The snow had compressed into a hard plate of ice, and beneath that the frozen earth was as unyielding as granite. It pressed against the bone, a dull, bruising point of contact. She visualized the pressure point. She imagined a small cushion of air forming there. It was a futile mental exercise, but it occupied the brain. It kept the neural pathways active. Think about the hip. Think about the knee. Think about the elbow. It was a tour of the anatomy of suffering. The darkness played tricks with scale. In the absence of visual references, she felt simultaneously huge and microscopic. Sometimes she felt like a giant, her body spanning miles of forest, her breath the wind itself. Other times she felt tiny, a speck of dust buried under a mountain of ice. This disorienting shift in perspective was a symptom of sensory deprivation. The brain, lacking input, lost its calibration. She anchored herself by touching the tip of her tongue to the back of her teeth. I am this size, I am here. The wind shifted direction, coming down from the trees to scour the forest floor. It blew the loose snow into her face, tiny, hard pellets of ice that stung like sand. They hit her eyelids, her forehead, the exposed strip of skin between the goggles and the scarf. She squeezed her eyes shut. The wind hissed around her, finding the gaps in her clothing. It was a liquid cold flowing up her sleeves, down her collar. It was searching for the heat. It was a thief. She huddled deeper into the snow, trying to present a smaller profile. She became a turtle, retracting into the shell of the drift. The concept of enemy felt abstract, almost absurd. Who else would be out here? Who else would be lying in the dark, freezing by choice? It seemed impossible that another human being was mirroring her suffering a few hundred meters away. And yet she knew he was there, or someone like him. The war did not stop for the cold. The war used the cold. The cold was a weapon, just like the rifle. She was wielding the cold, using her endurance to outlast the other. It was a contest of biology. Whose metabolism would fail first? Whose will would crack? She thought of the bullet in the chamber. It was a small brass bottle of fire. It was the only warm thing in the world, potentially. If she pulled the trigger, the powder would ignite, burning at thousands of degrees. For a millisecond, there would be heat. There would be light. The thought was comforting. She carried a pocket of summer in the chamber of her gun. She just had to wait for the right moment to release it. The hunger was a deep, resonant emptiness. Her stomach had stopped growling hours ago. It had simply collapsed on itself. The body had switched to ketosis, burning the fat stores. She could feel a strange, metallic taste in her mouth, the taste of ketones. It was the taste of self-consumption. She felt light, ethereal. The heavy, leaden feeling of the muscles was countered by a strange buoyancy of the mind. She felt like she could float up out of the snow and drift among the trees like a spirit. She had to remind herself of gravity. Heavy, you are heavy, you are lead. A visual anomaly appeared in the darkness, a faint, rhythmic flashing in the corner of her eye. Flash, flash, flash. It was blue, faint, pulsing. She turned her eyes towards it and it disappeared. She looked away and it returned. It was a phosphene, a pressure signal from the eye itself, or perhaps it was the beginning of the end. She blinked hard, squeezing the tear ducts. The flashing stopped. It was just a glitch in the biological machine. The silence was broken by the cry of a distant animal. A wolf, a lynx. It was a high, wailing sound, mournful and terrifying. Ea-oo-hua. It echoed through the valley, bouncing off the frozen hills. It sounded lonely. It sounded like the voice of the winter itself. She listened to it fade away. It was a reminder that this was not a human place. This was the domain of the wild, the furred, the fanged. She was an intruder here, a soft, hairless ape wrapped in stolen wool. She felt a profound sense of trespass. The cold in her feet had moved up past the shins to the knees. Her lower legs were effectively gone. They were dead weight, anchors dragging her down. She tried to flex the calf muscles, a faint, sluggish response. The blood was thick, struggling to push through the constricted vessels. She knew she would have frostbite. The question was not if, but how much. Would she lose a toe, a foot? It was a calculation of loss. A toe was a small price for a successful mission. A foot was a high price. Life was the highest price. She accepted the bargaining table. She visualized the map of the sector in her mind, the clearing, the rise of the hill, the creek bed frozen solid, the listening post. She traced the contour lines in her head. She placed herself on the map, a blue dot in a sea of white. She placed the enemy, red dots, theoretical, moving in the dark. She played a game of mental chess. If he moves to the creek, I have him. If he stays in the trees, I wait. The mental map was bright, colorful, sharp. It was a relief from the gray blur of reality. The scarf was becoming a problem. The ice buildup was so thick it was blocking the air intake. She had to adjust it. This required movement. She debated the risk. To suffocate was not an option. To move was dangerous. She chose the lesser evil. Slowly, with infinite caution, she raised her left hand. The movement was stiff, jerky. The frozen canvas of the sleeve crinkled with a sound like crushing paper. Crinkle crunch. It sounded like an explosion. She paused. She waited. Silence. She continued. Brought the mitten up to her face. She pushed the ice-crusted wool down, away from her nose. The cold air rushed in, raw and unfiltered. It shocked her lungs. She gasped, a quiet, sharp intake of breath. HHHHK. The fresh oxygen made her dizzy. She left the scarf down for a moment, letting the moisture on her face freeze instantly. Then she pulled it back up, arranging it to create a new air pocket. The sound of the fabric scraping against her skin was loud. She froze again, waiting for the reaction. Nothing. The darkness covered her. The relief of the fresh air was temporary. The cold was now attacking the wet skin around her mouth. It stung like acid. She pressed her lips together, hiding them inside the mouth. She felt the skin tightening, the collagen contracting. Her face was becoming a mask of parchment. She looked up at the sky. The clouds were moving. She could see the motion of the darker patches against the lighter patches. The wind aloft was strong. It was driving the weather system. A break in the clouds opened up, larger than before. A shaft of moonlight, pale and watery, filtered down. It did not strike the ground directly, but it illuminated the air. The darkness shifted from black to a deep, ghostly silver gray. The vintage drawing was now done in silver point on black paper. The edges of the snow drifts caught the light, gleaming with a dull, metallic luster. The trees cast long, faint shadows that stretched across the clearing like bars of a cage. The moonlight changed the tactical situation. She was now slightly more visible, but so was the enemy. She scanned the clearing with renewed intensity. The silver light revealed the texture of the snow in high relief. Every bump, every dip was visible. She looked for the anomaly, the shape that didn't fit, the shadow that was too thick. There, near the center of the clearing, a dark shape in a hollow. It looked like a log. Had it been there before, she searched her memory of the daylight. There had been drifts, there had been undulations. Had there been a log, she wasn't sure. The doubt was a splinter in her mind. She watched the shape. It was oblong low. It was covered in snow, but the sides were dark. She focused the reticle of her eyes on it. Be a log, be a log. She watched it for 10 minutes. The wind blew snow over it. It did not move. It did not shiver. It did not breathe. It was a log. She exhaled. The tension drained, leaving the cold in its place. It was a false alarm born of the changing light, but it was a good drill. It proved she was still alert. The cold was seeping into her chest now. The core was being breached. She could feel the chill in her sternum, in her ribs. It was a deep, aching cold that made her want to curl into a fetal ball. She resisted the urge. To curl up was to surrender the firing position. She stayed prone, pressing her chest against the ice. She used the hate to keep warm. Not hate for the enemy, but hate for the cold, hate for the wind, hate for the discomfort. It was a clean, burning fuel. I will not freeze. I will not yield. She began to recite a poem in her head. It was a child's poem about a bear sleeping in a den. The bear sleeps deep, the snow is high, the winter wind goes rushing by. It was a simple, rhythmic chant. She repeated it over and over, syncing the syllables with her heartbeat. The bear sleeps deep. Thud, 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 thud. It was a mantra of survival. The bear survived the winter by sleeping. She would survive by waking. She was the anti-bear. The texture of the rifle bolt under her thumb was a comfort. It was a hard, geometric reality. The ball of the handle was perfectly round. She rubbed her thumb over it through the mitten. Round, smooth, cold. It was a worry stone. It kept her hand from freezing completely. The night seemed to stretch out infinitely in both directions. The dawn was a myth. The sunset was a legend. There was only this, the black forest, the silver snow, the cold that ate the bones. She felt a strange peace settle over her. It was the peace of the statue, the peace of the stone. She had no desires. She had no fears. She only had the weight. The night had ceased to move. It hung suspended in the air, a heavy, motionless curtain of black velvet that had swallowed the world whole. The concept of a clock ticking, of gears turning and hands sweeping across a dial, felt like a heresy in this timeless vacuum. Here, in the deep hollow of the forest, time was not a river that flowed. It was a glacier that sat, immense and crushing, inching forward only by the breaking of stone and the grinding of ice. The vintage colored pencil aesthetic that framed her vision had become a study in negative space. The artist had put down the pencils and taken up a block of compressed charcoal, rubbing it fiercely into the grain of the paper until the white of the snow was barely a ghostly suggestion beneath the heavy, suffocating black. The world was no longer drawn. It was erased. She lay at the center of this erasure, a consciousness fighting to maintain its outline against the encroaching void. The cold was absolute. It was not a temperature. It was a physical law, a constant like gravity or the speed of light. It permeated every atom of the forest, slowing the vibration of matter, bringing the universe to a standstill. Her body was merely another object in this field of entropy, a warm anomaly that the winter was patiently working to correct. The heat of her core was a small, stubborn error in the equation of the night, and the wind was the mathematician seeking to zero it out. The silence was a solid wall. It pressed against her eardrums with a hydrostatic pressure, a deep-sea weight. In this profound quiet, the internal machinery of her existence was deafening. The friction of her eyelids blinking was a rasping sound, like dry leaves rubbing together. The air moving through her nasal passages was a roaring gale. The slow, rhythmic thud of her heart was the pounding of a heavy hammer wrapped in felt, echoing through the cavern of her ribs. Thud, thud, thud. It was a lonely sound, the only percussion in a silent symphony. She listened to it with a detached fascination, wondering how long the engine would keep turning on such thin fuel. Her vision was swimming in the gloom. The lack of photons forced the brain to invent light. She saw swirling clouds of purple and green static, faint nebulas that drifted across the black canvas of the trees. These were not things in the world. They were the firing of starved neurons, the visual noise of a system running at maximum gain. She watched the phantoms dance, knowing them for what they were: a green spiral, a pulsing blue orb, a geometric lattice of faint gray lines. They were beautiful in a sickly, hallucinatory way, a private fireworks display in the freezing dark. She let them pass, anchoring her gaze on the solid, unmoving blackness of the birch trunk to her left. The tree was real. The colors were lies. The sensation in her legs had vanished entirely. From the hips down, she was a statue. The nerves had stopped sending distress signals hours ago, surrendering to the inevitable. It was a terrifying liberation. Without the pain of the cold in her toes, she could almost pretend she was floating, detached from the earth. But she knew the danger of this comfort. The numbness was the precursor to the death of the tissue. Somewhere in the dark, inside the felt boots, her cells were crystallizing, the water inside them turning to ice shards that punctured the membranes. It was a silent, microscopic violence. She tried to visualize the blood flowing down, a warm red river cutting through the ice, but the image was weak. The cold was stronger than her imagination. The rifle, the Mosin Nagant, was a bar of shadow in her hands. The metal had equalized with the ambient temperature, becoming a heat sink of perfect efficiency. Through the thick wool of her mittens, she could feel the hard, unyielding geometry of the receiver. It felt dense, heavier than it had been during the day. It was as if the cold had added mass to the steel. The frost on the barrel was now a thick, shaggy coat, a biological growth of ice that softened the weapon's outline. If she were to breathe on it, her breath would freeze instantly, adding another layer to the accumulation. She kept her breath to herself, recycling the warmth inside the ice mask of her scarf. The hunger was a distant memory replaced by a strange, light-headed clarity. The body had consumed the contents of the stomach, then the glycogen in the liver, and was now harvesting the fat stores. The bloodstream was full of ketones, a chemical fuel that made the mind feel sharp, brittle, almost euphoric. She felt like a glass instrument, fragile and precise, vibrating at a high frequency. The thoughts that floated through her mind were stripped of emotion, reduced to pure logic. Wind from the north. Velocity low, visibility zero, target absent. It was a binary code of survival. She focused on the texture of the snow immediately beneath her chin. In the pitch dark, she could not see it, but she could feel the radiant cold of it through the scarf. It was a block of dry ice, sublimating slowly. She imagined the structure of the crystals, hexagonal plates, stellar dendrites, fern-like branches. A city of ice built on a microscopic scale, crushing under the weight of her head. She was a giant sleeping on a city of glass. The metaphor pleased her. It gave her a sense of scale, of power. She was not a victim of the snow. She was a geological force resting upon it. The wind began to moan again, a low, mournful sound that rose from the belly of the valley. It was the voice of the landscape, a groan of tectonic stress. It moved through the pine needles with a sibilant hiss, shhhhhhshhh, like a nurse shushing a dying patient. The sound was hypnotic. It invited sleep. It promised that if she just closed her eyes, the cold would stop hurting. It promised that the blackness would become warm. She recognized the seduction. It was the siren song of hypothermia. She bit the inside of her cheek hard. The sharp pinch of pain was a wake-up call. The metallic taste of blood was a shock. I am awake. I am alive. I am hurting. Pain was the anchor. A branch fell somewhere in the distance. Crash. The sound was shocking in the silence, a violent disruption of the peace. It echoed, bouncing off the trees, distorting into a series of diminishing clatters. Then silence rushed back in, heavier than before. She analyzed the sound, too heavy for a twig, too clumsy for a man. It was deadfall, a rotten limb finally giving up the ghost under the weight of the snow. Gravity winning another small victory. She did not flinch. Her muscles were locked in a rigor of tension. To flinch would require energy she did not have. The darkness seemed to possess a weight, a physical viscosity. She felt as though she were lying at the bottom of a deep ocean trench, the pressure of miles of black water pushing down on her. The air was thick, hard to pull into the lungs. Every breath was a lifting of a weight. Inhale, lift, exhale, drop. The rhythm was slow, agonizingly slow. She counted the seconds between breaths. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The body was shutting down the non-essential systems. The pilot light was dimming. She forced a deeper breath, expanding the ribs against the resistance of the frozen jacket. The crackle of the stiff fabric was loud in her ears. Crunch. It sounded like walking on dry toast. She thought of the fire again. This time it was a small candle flame, blue at the base, yellow at the tip. It was steady, unmoving. She placed the image of the candle in the center of her mind, in the pineal gland. She focused all her mental energy on that single point of light. I am the candle. The wick is my spine. The wax is my flesh. It was a meditation, a way to center the consciousness away from the freezing extremities. The candle burned in the dark cathedral of her skull, a tiny, defiant sun. The smell of the night was complex. Beneath the overwhelming scent of ice and ozone, there were subtle notes of decay. The smell of wet bark, the smell of dormant fungus, the smell of old needles decomposing under the snow. It was the smell of the forest floor, a slow, cold composting process. It reminded her that life was cyclic. The tree falls, the tree rots, the tree feeds the new sapling. She was part of this cycle. If she died here, she would become soil. She would feed the birch. The thought was not morbid. It was ecological. It was a factual acceptance of her place in the biosphere. A sudden shiver took her, more violent than the last. It started in the solar plexus and radiated out to the limbs, a convulsive spasm that shook her entire frame. Her teeth chattered, a rapid-fire clicking, tack, 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 that she could not control. The rifle bounced slightly against her shoulder. The vibration traveled down the barrel. The shiver was the body's emergency generator kicking in, burning the last reserves of fuel to create kinetic heat. She let it happen, riding the wave of the spasm until it exhausted itself. Then she clamped down again, tightening the core. Still. Be stone. The warmth generated was fleeing, dissipated instantly into the frozen ground. The net gain was zero. The cost was high. She adjusted the focus of her eyes, staring into the middle distance where the clearing should be. The vintage drawing was all shadow now. The trees were not visible as objects, but as absences of stars if there were stars. They were negative shapes cut out of the slightly lighter gray of the sky. She scanned the horizon line. Was that a movement? A flicker of darker shadow against dark shadow? She locked her gaze. She held her breath. The shape remained static. It was a trick of the parallax. A branch moving in the wind, or just the mind projecting a target onto the blank screen. She relaxed the eyes, widening the field of view to catch the peripheral motion. Nothing. Just the wind, just the night. The scarf had become a torturous device. The ice buildup was so significant that it formed a hard, abrasive shell against her chin and lips. Every time she swallowed, the Adam's apple moved against the frozen wool, scraping the skin. It was a raw, stinging irritation. She wanted to pull it down, to rip it off, to feel the free air. But she knew the air would burn her lungs. The ice mask was a heat exchanger, reclaiming a fraction of the warmth from her exhalation. It was a survival tool, however painful. She tolerated the scrape. She tolerated the wet, cold misery of it. Her thoughts drifted to the concept of home. Home was a warm place, a place of vertical walls and horizontal floors, a place of soft fabrics and hot liquids. It felt like a different planet. It felt like a story she had read in a book once. Was it real? Did places like that exist? Or was the universe only this forest, this snow, this cold? The memory of warmth was fading, becoming abstract. She could remember the word warm, but she could no longer recall the sensation. The nerve endings had forgotten the language of heat. They only spoke the dialect of ice. She felt a strange sensation in her left hand, the one supporting the ford of the rifle. It felt wet. Was the snow melting? Was she bleeding? She focused on the sensation. It was a phantom signal. The nerves were misfiring as they shut down. It was a hallucination of touch. My hand is dry. My hand is frozen. Ignore the wetness. She repeated the correction. The brain was an unreliable narrator in the hypothermic state. It told lies to comfort itself. She had to be the editor. She had to cross out the lies with the red pen of logic. The darkness was not uniform. There were varying degrees of black. The snow was a luminous black, reflecting the scattered atmospheric light. The trees were a matte black, absorbing everything. The sky was a flat, oppressive charcoal. She studied the gradients. She became a connoisseur of darkness. She could distinguish the shadow of a pine from the shadow of a birch by the texture of the blackness. The pine was rough, fuzzy. The birch was smooth, hard. A small animal moved nearby. A mouse? A shrew? She heard the tiny, frantic scratching of claws on bark. Scritch, scritch. It was climbing the tree next to her. She imagined the tiny heart beating at hundreds of beats per minute, a frantic engine of life. She envied the energy. She envied the fur. The sound stopped. The animal had paused or entered a hole or been taken by an owl. The silence returned, swallowing the small life. The cold was encroaching on her mind now. Thoughts were becoming sluggish, viscous. It was hard to finish a sentence in her head. The tree is wood. The snow is cold. The complexity of her inner monologue was devolving. She was losing the higher functions. The neocortex was going offline to save energy for the brainstem. She recognized the symptom. Fight it. Do math. She forced herself to calculate. 7 times 7 is 49. 8 times 8 is 64. 9 times 9 is 81. The numbers were hard, angular, distinct. They cut through the fog. They kept the lights on in the control room. The texture of the rifle strap was a tactile anchor. The canvas was frozen hard as wood. She ran her thumb along the edge of the strap, feeling the frayed threads. They were stiff, like wire bristles. She counted them by touch. 1, 2, 3. It was a sensory braille, reading the rifle with her hands because her eyes were useless. The wind shifted again, dropping into a dead calm. The stillness was terrifying. Without the wind, there was no sound at all. The ringing in her ears became a shriek. The sound of her own blood became a roar. She felt like she was trapped inside a bell jar, pumped free of air. The isolation was total. She was the last living thing on Earth, the last heartbeat in the universe. She looked at the patch of snow directly in front of the muzzle. In the absolute stillness, she saw a single crystal of frost grow on the metal sight post. It happened in slow motion. A tiny arm of ice reached out, branching, crystallizing from the moisture in the air. It was a microscopic act of creation in the midst of the void. She watched it with awe. It was perfect. It was geometric. It was deathly beautiful. It grew until it was 1 millimeter long, a tiny horn on the rifle. The fatigue was a heavy, leaden blanket. It pressed down on her eyelids, on her chest, on her will. It whispered that it was time to sleep, just for a minute, just rest your eyes. The temptation was overwhelming. The sleep would be warm. The sleep would be soft. She jerked her head up, a violent motion that cracked the neck vertebrae. Number sleep was death. The equation was simple. Sleep equals death. Wake equals life. She chose life even though it hurt. She chose the pain. She tried to wiggle the toes of her right foot. Nothing, not even a phantom sensation. The foot was a block of wood. She accepted this. The foot was a casualty. The mission was the priority. She focused on the knee. A dull ache, good. The knee was still there. She focused on the hip. A sharp bruise, good. The hip was still there. She performed a roll call of the body parts. Right hand, present. Left hand, present. Lungs functioning. Heart pumping. The squad was battered but present. The vintage aesthetic of the night began to shift again. The charcoal black seemed to acquire a grain, a texture like sandstone. The air looked particulate. She felt like she was breathing dust. It was the dry cold desiccating the mucous membranes. She longed for water, a cup of hot tea, a bowl of soup. The thought of steam rising from a cup was almost pornographic in its intensity. She pushed it away. Thirst was a distraction. She checked the safety on the rifle. It was a knob at the back of the bolt. She grabbed it with her mitten and pulled it back, rotating it to the left. It moved with a stiff, gummy resistance. Click, safety off. She was live. The weapon was ready. She rotated it back. Click, safety on. It was a fidget, a way to keep the hands moving, a way to reassure herself of the mechanism. The sound of the metal clicking was a sharp, man-made noise in the organic silence. It sounded like order. It sounded like purpose. The darkness above the trees seemed to lighten by a fraction of a degree. Not dawn, not yet, but a shift in the cloud density. Maybe the moon was trying to break through again. The gray of the sky went from charcoal to slate. It allowed a faint, diffuse illumination to return to the snow. The silver point drawing returned, faint and ghostly. The outlines of the trees became visible again. The world was reforming. She lay in the silver-gray gloom, a sentinel of the frost. She was not a girl. She was not a soldier. She was a function of the winter. She was the eye that watched. She was the finger on the trigger. She was the endurance. The night dragged on. The cold deepened. The silence stretched. She waited. The night had entered the hour of the wolf. It was that undefined, suspended span of time between the death of the darkness and the birth of the dawn, a period where the universe held its breath and the temperature plummeted to its absolute nadir. The world was no longer simply cold. It was brittle. The air had crystallized into a fragile lattice of nitrogen and oxygen, so cold that it seemed to crackle when she inhaled, tiny fissures opening in the atmosphere with every breath. The vintage-colored pencil, aesthetic of her vision, was now a study in deep, bruising purples and heavy, oily blacks. The artist had abandoned the charcoal for a stick of frozen ink. drawing the shadows with a heavy, saturated pressure that obscured the boundaries between the trees and the void. There was no light to speak of, only a residual, ghostly memory of luminosity trapped in the snow, a faint, decaying phosphorescence that offered no guidance to the eye. She lay at the bottom of this atmospheric trench, a solitary organism in a landscape of geology and ice. The distinction between her physical form and the frozen earth had been erased. She was no longer a person lying on the snow. She was a feature of the terrain, a mound of calcified wool and dormant flesh that had fused with the drifts. The snow beneath her had ceased to melt and refreeze. It had simply hardened into a cradle of concrete-like density, molding itself to the contours of her ribs and hips. She was locked in. To rise would require breaking the seal of the winter, a shattering of the ice carapace that felt impossible. She was a fossil in the making, waiting for the geological ages to pass. The silence was a physical weight, heavier than the equipment on her back. It was a silence that had density and mass. It pressed against her ears, a constant, crushing pressure that amplified the internal acoustics of her body. The sound of her own pulse was a slow, tectonic thudding in her neck. Thud, pause, thud, pause, a rhythm so slow it seemed to stop entirely between beats. She listened to the pauses, the long, terrifying gaps where the heart rested, wondering if it would gather the energy to contract again. Each beat was a victory of biology over thermodynamics. Each beat was a small, warm protest against the entropy of the universe. Her vision was a grainy field of visual static. The lack of photons caused the brain to hallucinate patterns in the dark, swirling eddies of violet mist, geometric grids of faint green lines, flashes of non-existent light. These were the phosphenes of the starved retina, the nervous system trying to calibrate itself in a vacuum. She watched the light show with a detached, clinical interest. A purple spiral drifted across the trunk of the birch tree. A cluster of green sparks exploded silently near the muzzle of the rifle. She did not react. She knew they were lies. The only truth was the black silhouette of the tree and the gray smudge of the snow. The cold had conquered her extremities and was now laying siege to the citadel of the core. The sensation in her arms and legs was gone, replaced by a heavy, wooden inertness. She felt as though her limbs had been amputated and replaced with prosthetics made of lead. The cold was a creeping blue fluid, rising up the humerus, rising up the femur, seeking the warm organs in the center. She visualized her heart and lungs as a small, glowing campfire in a vast, dark plain. The wolves of the cold were circling the fire, moving closer with every gust of wind. She had to feed the fire. She took a deliberate breath, holding the oxygen in the alveoli, willing the metabolic furnace to burn a little brighter. Burn, burn, burn. The rifle, the Mosin Nagant, had become a rod of pure cold. The steel was no longer metal. It was a superconductor of heat, pulling the warmth from the air, from her mittens, from the world. The frost on the barrel was thick, a shag carpet of ice crystals that stood up in spikes. The wooden stock was frozen hard, the oil finish dull and tacky. She felt a strange kinship with the weapon. It was a machine designed to function in the cold. It did not complain. It did not shiver. It simply waited. She tried to emulate the rifle, be steel, be wood, be mechanism. The hunger was a hollow, echoing cave in her torso. The body had long since stopped signaling for food. It was now in a state of autophagic preservation, consuming its own tissues to maintain the core temperature. She felt light, almost weightless, despite the heavy gear. It was a sensation of floating, of the mind detaching from the heavy, frozen anchor of the body. Her thoughts were clear, crystalline, brittle. They moved slowly like ice flows on a dark river. The wind is north. The range is close. The wait is long. Simple declarative sentences. No complex logic, no philosophy, just the facts of the freeze. The air she breathed was a solid object. It entered her nose as jagged shards of glass cutting the mucous membranes. The inside of her nose was dry, crusted with frozen blood. The throat was a parchment tube. Every swallow was a dry click. She longed for the steam of tea, for the wet heat of soup. The memory of liquid water was a torture. She banished it. She focused on the ice. The ice was the reality. The ice was the water of this world. A sudden sound, a sharp crack, echoed through the forest like a whip crack. It was the sound of a tree splitting deep in its core. The frost cracks were getting louder as the temperature bottomed out. The trees were screaming. She felt the vibration of the crack travel through the ground and into her chest. It was a communication from the flora. We are breaking. We are dying. She felt a moment of pity for the birch tree next to her. It had no wool. It had no fire. It had only its bark. She whispered a silent apology to the tree. I am sorry. We are both freezing. The wind began to stir again, a low, serpentine draft that moved along the forest floor. It did not shake the branches. It flowed like water around the trunks, carrying with it a fine mist of ice dust. The dust hit her face, stinging the exposed skin around the eyes. It gathered in the eyebrows, forming heavy ridges of ice. It coated the eyelashes, gluing them together. She had to blink forcefully to break the seal. Snap! The sound of the eyelashes separating was audible in the silence. It was a microscopic violence. She felt a phantom sensation on her cheek, a warm, soft touch like a hand brushing away a tear. It was vivid, shocking. She almost turned her head into the caress. Then she realized it was the paradoxical sensation of the nerves dying. The extreme cold was being misinterpreted by the brain as heat. It was a dangerous illusion. If she believed it, she might relax. She might open the jacket. She might die. She recoiled from the phantom warmth, pressing her face harder into the frozen scarf. It is cold, it is not warm, it is ice. The vintage-colored pencil aesthetic shifted slightly. The deep purples began to fade into a flat, dead slate gray. The heavy blacks remained, but the shadows seemed to lose some of their depth. It was the first, almost imperceptible sign that the night was aging. The dawn was still hours away, but the quality of the darkness was changing. It was becoming thinner, less substantial. The wolf hour was passing into the dead hour, the time when spirits walked, the time when the will was weakest. She counted the trees in her sector again. It was a ritual to keep the mind tethered. 1 birch, 3 pines, 2 stumps, 1 fallen log. The numbers were safe. The numbers did not freeze. She memorized the pattern of the bark on the nearest pine. It looked like a map of a broken world. Valleys of shadow, plateaus of gray bark. She traveled the map with her eyes, a tiny explorer on a vertical continent. Her legs were gone. She accepted this. They were heavy logs attached to her hips. She tried to visualize the toes inside the boots. She saw them as white, waxy, frozen. She wondered if they would ever be pink again. It didn't matter. Walking was a problem for later. For now, she only needed to lie still. Lying still was the one thing she could do perfectly. She was a master of stasis. The scarf was a solid block of ice now, a heavy muzzle that pulled at her neck. The moisture from her breath had frozen into a stalactite that hung from her chin. It was uncomfortable, a constant weight, but it was also a shield. It trapped the heat. She breathed into the small, humid cave of the scarf. The air tasted of wool and ketones. It was the taste of survival. She thought of the enemy. Was he asleep? Was he freezing? Was he dreaming of a stove? She felt a strange connection to him. They were the only two people in the world who understood this specific misery. They were brothers in the cold, separated by a few hundred meters of snow and a war. If she saw him, she would shoot. But she would not hate. It was just physics. Two objects cannot occupy the same space. Two soldiers cannot hold the same ground. The visual static in her eyes intensified. She saw a flash of yellow light in the periphery. Flash. She turned her eyes, nothing, just the gray snow. Flash again. It was the optic nerve misfiring. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing the lids tight. She saw a kaleidoscope of geometric patterns in the dark, triangles, circles, spirals. They were bright neon colors. It was a party in her head. She opened her eyes. The gray world rushed back in. The party was over. The silence was broken by the whoosh of a large accumulation of snow falling from a branch nearby. It landed with a soft, heavy thump, sending a cloud of powder into the air. The powder drifted over her, settling on her back on the rifle. She became a little whiter, a little more buried. She welcomed the extra layer. Snow was an insulator, the igloo effect. Let the winter build a house around her. She focused on the texture of the rifle strap. It was canvas, stiff with frost. She could see the individual threads of the weave magnified by her focus. They looked like ropes. Some of the threads were frayed, standing up like tiny frozen trees. She counted the frayed threads. 1, 2, 3, 4. It was a microscopic forest on the strap of a gun. The fatigue was a siren song. It was a sweet, heavy melody that pulled at her eyelids. Sleep. Just for a moment, sleep. The voice in her head was persuasive. It sounded like her mother. It sounded like safety. She shook her head, a tiny, jerky motion. No, she bit her lip until she tasted copper. The pain was sharp, real. The pain drove the voice away. She was not a child. She was a weapon. Weapons did not sleep. The cold in her core was a dull ache, a bruising sensation in the chest. The heart was working hard, pumping thick, cold blood through constricted veins. She felt the beat in her ribs, thud, thud. It was a slow, stubborn rhythm. It was the only clock she had. She counted the beats. 100, 200, 500. The numbers piled up, a mountain of time. She looked at the sky. The cloud deck was solid, unbroken. No stars. No moon, just a ceiling of heavy gray wool. It felt low, as if she could reach up and touch it. It trapped the cold against the earth. It was a lid on a coffin. She felt the claustrophobia of the open air, the paradox of the infinite space feeling small. The smell of the morning began to drift in. It was subtle, a change in the ions of the air. It smelled less like old earth and more like fresh ice. It smelled sharp, clean, sterile. It was the smell of the pre-dawn. The time when the light begins to gather below the horizon, pushing the darkness up. She flared her nostrils, testing the air. Yes, a shift. The night was breaking. Her hands were claws inside the mittens. She tried to open them to stretch the fingers. The resistance was immense. The joints were stiff, the tendons tight. She managed to open the hand halfway, then closed it again around the stock. It was a slow, ratcheting movement. Click, click, click. The hand was a rusted machine. She worried about the trigger finger. Would it bend? She sent a signal, flex, a tiny movement. Yes, it would bend. Once. Maybe twice. That was all she needed. The vintage drawing was losing its deep blacks. The charcoal was being rubbed out, replaced by a wash of cold, flat slate. The blue hour was approaching again, but from the other side. The morning blue, a colder, harder blue than the evening. The visibility began to expand. The tree line, which had been a solid wall of black, began to separate into individual trunks. She could see the gaps between the trees. She could see the shadows lengthening. She scanned the sector. The clearing was a sea of gray waves. The drifts were motionless. The wind had sculpted them into sharp ridges. She looked for the anomaly, the shape that didn't belong, the dark mound, the straight line. Her eyes moved in a grid, left to right, near to far, nothing. The stage was still empty. She felt a deep, profound loneliness. It was not a sadness, but a realization of her singularity. She was the only consciousness in this valley. The animals were asleep or hiding. The trees were dormant. The enemy was invisible. She was the only witness to the dawn. She felt a responsibility to watch it happen, to record the transition from black to gray. The cold was biting her face now. The wind had picked up, swirling the loose snow. It stung her cheeks. It made her eyes water. The tears froze on her lashes. She blinked them away. The pain was good. The pain meant the nerves were still alive. She welcomed the sting. She thought of the bullet again, the tiny brass canister of heat. It was waiting in the chamber, patient as a monk. It was the seed of fire. She imagined the firing pin striking the primer, the spark, the ignition, the expansion of gas, the flight of the projectile. It was a sequence of events she knew better than her own name. It was her purpose. The light continued to grow imperceptibly. The sky was now a distinct shade lighter than the trees. The horizon was re-establishing itself. The world was coming back, but it was a cold world, a dead world, a world of iron and ice. She prepared herself for the morning. The morning was the dangerous time. The light brought visibility. Visibility brought danger. The enemy would wake. The birds would fly. The stillness would be broken. She tightened her grip on the rifle. She deepened her breath. She locked her focus. The night was ending. The freeze was not. She lay in the snow, a statue of wool and will, waiting for the sun that would bring no warmth. She was the sniper girl. She was the winter. The dawn did not arrive with a fanfare of color or a sudden burst of warmth. It arrived as a slow, agonizing dilution of the darkness, a gradual draining of the ink from the sky, until the world was left as a washed-out monochromatic sketch on gray paper. The vintage-colored pencil aesthetic returned to the palette of the previous morning, but the colors were colder now, more brittle. The blue of the snow was paler, a sickly, cyanotic hue that suggested a lack of oxygen. The charcoal black of the trees had faded to a flat, lifeless slate. The air itself seemed to have aged overnight, becoming thicker, heavier, a medium that resisted movement and smothered sound. The transition from the hour of the wolf to the hour of the ghost was complete. The world was revealed, but it was not revived. She lay in the exact same position she had occupied for the last 23 hours. The snow around her had ceased to be a separate element. It had become an extension of her own biology. The heat of her body, fleeing the core, had melted the crystals in the immediate vicinity of her uniform, creating a rigid, icy mold that encased her torso, her hips, and her legs. She was no longer resting on the snow. She was embedded in it, a component of the landscape as permanent and unmoving as the granite boulders beneath the drift. The boundary between the woman and the winter had dissolved. To extract her now would require a pickaxe. To stand up would be to tear the earth. The silence of the morning was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the thoughts from the mind and left only a resonant, high-pitched ringing in the inner ear. It was the sound of the nervous system idling, a carrier wave of pure existence. The wind had died completely, leaving the air still and stratified. The cold settled into the hollows of the land, pooling like invisible water, rising up the trunks of the trees, submerging the forest floor in a bath of sub-zero stillness. She felt the pressure of this cold against her eardrums, a physical weight that pinned her to the ground. Her vision was a tunnel, narrowed by the swelling of her face and the fatigue of the optic nerve. The peripheral world was a blur of gray static, a vignette effect drawn in soft graphite. Only the center of her field of view remained clear, the circle of snow, the birch trunk, the dark line of the rifle barrel. She focused on the front sight post of the Nugget. It was a small, black vertical line. It was the axis of her world. A tiny pyramid of frost had grown on the tip of the post, a delicate crystalline structure that caught the faint light. She studied the crystal. It was a masterpiece of geometry, a cathedral of ice built on a foundation of steel. It was the only new thing that had happened in hours. The sensation in her body had simplified. The complex map of pains and aches, the burning knees, the cramping calves, the stinging skin, had been smoothed out by the overwhelming anesthesia of the deep cold. She felt a profound, heavy numbness that was almost comfortable. It was the comfort of stone. Stone did not feel pain. Stone did not shiver. Stone simply existed. She allowed herself to drift into this mineral state. She visualized her bones turning to quartz, her muscles turning to clay, her blood turning to mercury. It was a meditation on solidity. The hunger was gone. The thirst was gone. The biological imperatives had been silenced by the metabolic slowdown. She was a machine running on fumes, the pilot light barely flickering in the center of the chest. She breathed in a shallow, sipping intake of air. The air was dry, abrasive, tasting of iron filings and ozone. She breathed out a faint wisp of gray steam that dissipated instantly in the hungry air. The rhythm was geological. 1 breath per minute, maybe 2. The heart beat slowly, a heavy, reluctant thudding that echoed in the frozen ground. Thud, thud. The light strengthened, shifting from the deep indigo of pre-dawn to the flat, shadowless gray of the day. The sun was a rumor, a pale disk buried behind layers of stratus clouds. It offered no heat, only a diffuse, glare-inducing luminescence that turned the snow into a sheet of white paper. The lack of shadows made depth perception impossible. The trees looked like cardboard cutouts pasted against a gray wall. The clearing was a blank space, a void in the texture of the forest. She scanned this blank space with the mechanical precision of a radar dish. Her eyes moved in a grid, searching for the disruption in the pattern. A dark pixel in a white field, a horizontal line in a vertical world, a movement that was not the wind. Her brain processed the visual data without emotion. It was a sorting algorithm: tree, tree, stump, snow, snow, anomaly, no, snow. The loop ran continuously, a background process that required no conscious thought. The scarf around her face was a solid block of ice, a heavy prosthetic jaw. It was fused to the collar of her jacket, creating a sealed environment for her mouth and nose. The air inside was humid, stale, recycled. It smelled of wet wool and the ketone-rich breath of starvation. The ice pressed against her lips, a hard, cold kiss that never ended. She did not try to move it. To break the seal would be to let the true cold in. The ice mask was a filter, tempering the violence of the atmosphere. She noticed a movement in the middle distance, a shifting of the gray texture. She locked her gaze. Her heart rate spiked, a momentary acceleration of the engine. Thud, 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 she watched. A shape detached itself from the background. It was gray, silent, fluid. It moved with a ghostly grace, drifting over the snow without breaking the crust. It was a lynx. The cat stopped, lifting a paw. Its ear tufts twitched. It looked directly at her. Its eyes were pale gold, cold and intelligent. It saw her. It saw the mound of snow that breathed. It did not care. It was a fellow predator patrolling the same freezer. It turned and melted back into the trees, disappearing like smoke. The encounter lasted 10 seconds. It was the only social interaction of the day. She exhaled slowly. The adrenaline faded, leaving a residue of exhaustion. The cold rushed back in to fill the space left by the excitement. She felt the chill in her marrow. The bones were cold. The actual calcium and phosphate structures of her skeleton were freezing. It was a deep, resonating ache that felt like a vibration. She focused on the rifle stock. The wood was the only organic thing she was touching. She drew a faint sense of comfort from the birch. It had been a tree once. It had known the sun. Now it was a tool just like her. The vintage-colored pencil drawing of the world was now fully illuminated, though the light was weak. The details of the bark on the nearby tree were hyperreal. She could see the lichen, the peeling layers, the dark fissures. She could see the frozen sap that had bled from a wound in the wood. It looked like amber frozen in time. She counted the layers of the peel. 1, 2, 3, 4. It was a way to keep the mind from unraveling. Counting was order. Chaos was the enemy. She thought of the concept of 24 hours. The Earth had completed one full rotation on its axis. The sun had risen, traveled across the sky unseen, set, traveled beneath the Earth, and risen again. The cycle was complete. She had occupied this singular point in space for the entire duration. She was the axis around which her own world turned. The thought gave her a sense of permanence. She was not a transient visitor. She was a feature of the location. If she stayed here another day, she would begin to grow moss. If she stayed a week, she would become a hill. The wind picked up slightly, a morning breeze that signaled the changing of the atmospheric guard. It ruffled the fur of her hood. It blew a fine spray of snow across the scope lenses. She did not wipe them. The snow was camouflage. The snow was protection. She let it accumulate. She was becoming adrift with a rifle. Her finger inside the mitten rested against the trigger guard. She sent a signal to the muscle. Check. A microscopic twitch. The tendon moved. The connection was frayed, thin, but intact. The weapon could still be fired. The potential for violence remained, a dormant seed buried in the wool. She did not need to fire to be dangerous. The threat was the weapon. The presence was the weapon. The cold in her feet was absolute. There was no sensation below the ankles. She knew intellectually that the tissue was damaged, the cells had burst, the blood had coagulated. But here in the white silence it didn't matter. She didn't need feet to wait. She didn't need feet to watch. She was a torso and a pair of eyes. The rest was baggage. She jettisoned the concern for her limbs. It was a luxury she couldn't afford. The sky began to show a texture of heavy, fibrous clouds like wet wool soaked in gray water. It was a mackerel sky, predicting a storm. The pressure was dropping. She could feel it in her sinuses, a dull, expanding headache behind the eyes. A storm meant wind. Wind meant lower wind chill. Lower wind chill meant the end of the endurance equation. But the storm was hours away. For now, there was only the flat, static gray. She focused on the sound of the silence. It had changed tone since the night. The night silence was heavy, bass-heavy. The morning silence was sharp, treble, brittle. It sounded like glass about to shatter. It hummed with a tension that was almost electric. She tuned her hearing to the frequency of the forest. She heard the sap moving in the trees, a slow, viscous creep. She heard the snow settling, a microscopic compaction of crystals. She heard the rotation of the earth, a low, grinding hum that was felt rather than heard. The rifle barrel was now the same color as the sky, a flat, non-reflective gray. The bluing had been obscured by the frost and the light. It looked like a rod of solidified fog. She looked at the gap between the barrel and the stock, a tiny space engineered to allow the barrel to vibrate freely. The free-floating barrel, It was filled with ice. The vibration would be dampened. The shot would be slightly off. She noted this variable. She would aim high and right. The correction was automatic, a reflex of the sniper's brain. She closed her eyes for a slow count of 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The darkness behind her eyelids was a relief. It was warm, or at least less cold than the white glare. When she opened them, the world was unchanged. The same trees, the same snow, the same gray light. It was a loop, a GIF playing over and over. She was the viewer and the subject. The thought of leaving occurred to her. The mission duration was technically over. The relief team should be moving up, but the thought was distant, abstract. Leaving required movement. Leaving required breaking the ice shell. Leaving required re-entering the world of noise and people and heat. The prospect was exhausting. It was easier to stay. It was easier to remain in the vintage drawing. The inertia of the cold was a powerful force. It held her down with the gravity of a black hole. She imagined the relief team finding her. They would see a mound of snow. They would brush it away and find the green helmet, the canvas jacket. They would touch her shoulder. She would not move. She would be part of the earth. They would have to chip her out. The image was peaceful. It was a statue in a garden of winter. But the duty was stronger than the inertia. The duty was a wire of steel running through her spine. She was not a statue. She was a soldier. She checked the sector again. Nothing. The clearing was empty. The enemy was either gone or dead or waiting just like her. It was a draw, a stalemate played out on a board of ice. She felt a deep, vibrating shudder in the ground. A vehicle, a tank, miles away. The sound traveled through the bedrock. It was a low purr, barely perceptible. It was the sound of the war waking up in the distance. It was the sound of the machine that had sent her here. It was a reminder that the world existed beyond the tree line. It broke the spell of isolation, just a fraction. The light reached its peak brightness for the day, a dim, watery illumination that cast no shadows. It was high noon in the land of shadows. The 24-hour cycle was fully closed. She had seen the noon of yesterday, the twilight, the dark, the dawn, and now the noon of today. The circle was drawn. She was the dot in the center. She took a deep breath, filling the lungs to capacity. The ribs creaked against the jacket, the ice mask cracked slightly. The cold air flooded her system, a shock of clarity. I am here. I am awake. The mantra was faint but audible in the mind. She shifted her weight, a movement of 1 millimeter. The ice beneath her groaned. The bond was stressed but not broken. She settled back. The snow accepted her again. The visual field began to soften at the edges. The fatigue was reclaiming the eyes. The vintage-colored pencil strokes became broader, softer. The sharp lines of the trees blurred into the gray background. The world was fading into a wash of pastel blue and charcoal. It was a gentle dissolution. She kept the front sight post sharp. That was the rule. The world could blur, but the sight must be sharp. She focused on the black pin. It was the anchor. The snow began to fall again. Light, dry flakes that drifted straight down in the still air. They added a new layer to the drawing, a fresh coat of white paint on the finished canvas. They landed on her hat, on her shoulders, on the rifle. They covered the black steel. They covered the green wool. She watched the snow fall. It was hypnotic, endless, eternal. It was the curtain falling on the performance, but the actor did not leave the stage. She remained. The sniper girl lay in the white snow, a permanent fixture of the winter woods. The 24 hours were done. The waiting continued. The cold was a circle and she was the center.